A group was attacked by a gang wearing masks. One man was injured, and a girl stayed with him to check his condition. Only one person confronted the three attackers. Though he had the ardor of a sword, the man felt very nervous because he was not sure he could defeat an enemy without getting hurt. A boy suddenly appeared and attacked one of the criminals, making the masked man drop his weapon. The masked men demanded to know who he was. An ordinary 8-year-old boy passing by saved people by helping them avoid something that might have been irreversible. 100 years ago, 4 people gathered around a wounded man. They all tried to help Master Adelphus, who had protected one of them. Nearby, a creature named Dion tried to use magic to heal him. The master, though badly injured, pretended nothing terrible had happened, so the person he defended would not feel guilty, and the bleeding did not stop, so the creature began to worry about Edelfish. Using the seal, the student kept trying to heal the wounds on the human body, but Mother cared about only one thing: whether they could revive the disaster monster they had defeated. One student said there could be no sign of rebirth because the master had erased him from the face of the earth with magic. The young man tried to distract Delphus from the pain running through his whole body and said his master had not taught him this magic yet, implying it was too soon for him to leave them. But the man said it was only an improvised spell. The master said that if someone saw the trick once, they could repeat it and use it later. The young man did not want to hear that and asked him to stop. Milt seized every chance to speak with the master, and he was a magician, full of talent, purpose, and a sincere heart, and the master taught him every magic technique he knew. Zenobia was one of the nearby girls. Though small and afraid of ghosts, she grew up to become a warrior called the Holy Sword. Dion, the creature who tried to heal the man, became so skilled as a healer that he was called the water god's favorite child. Another student's name was Regina. A hero who had grown strong enough to deserve the title, she still often let her emotions show, and like everyone else, she cried. The master said goodbye to everyone there, told them he was proud of his students, and that they could manage on their own because he would be fine. But Dion did not want him to leave, and said they still needed him. The man could not speak anymore. His only thought was that his students had grown into fine people who would continue to serve the world well without his guidance. Edelphus closed his eyes as other people's tears fell on his face, feeling lucky that the place where he died had been blessed by his own disciples and that he had lived a good life. Later, the man heard voices like those his students used in his final moments, and a voice thanked Mr. Edelfest for his hard work. Walking down the corridor between the huge columns, the man asked the void who was speaking to him and where he was, and the voice answered that he was a beautiful, kind goddess. The girl did not reveal herself to the man, but said that, as a human, Edelthus could defeat the disaster monster, so she visited him to honor his contribution to humanity and welcome him as a new god. The goddess asked whether the man still had any regrets, and Edelf had thought about it because becoming a god was a great honor. The man said he had no regrets about his 120 years because they were beautiful, and though he had no children, he raised excellent students who became outstanding men and women. After thinking for a while, the man felt something was keeping him in the human world and asked the goddess whether he had really destroyed the disaster monster he had died to stop. The goddess warned that the disaster monster is one of God's apostles, so it won't be easy to destroy, and the man was stunned by what he heard. Adolphus was in despair because it meant everything he had worked for his whole life was in vain. The girl only noticed that his feet were amazing because he could do so much for a human. The goddess said the disaster monster would sleep for a while and leave people alone, and suggested they discuss the rest after he became a god. The man could not accept what he heard. The catastrophe monster was the enemy of humanity. More than anything, Adelphus had spent his entire 120 years trying to kill it. He still could not accept that it had survived simply by falling asleep. Adelphus faced the goddess and decided to tell her what he really wanted. Relieved, the girl welcomed his full attention. A man called the goddess, and she appeared before him to ask whether he had chosen to become a god. She was surprised to learn he truly wanted that, only to destroy the monster of disaster. The goddess hesitated, then said there were some restrictions, and Adelphus did not understand what the girl meant, so he asked her to explain. The disaster monster is a former god, a fallen cursed beast that still holds divine power and kept that power by merging with a fallen god. When the power of God meets an equal force on earth and cannot prevail, The gods act through the earthly inhabitants, rather than intervening directly. The man remembered that one of his students, Dion, was the water god's favorite child. The goddess said Oedipus had grasped the essence of what she was telling him. The goddess noted that each of the master's disciples was a favorite of a particular god. The hero Regina was the favorite of the holy goddess. Milk was the favorite child of the god of magic, and Zenobia was the favorite of the god of swords. The goddess spoke about Adelphus's students, smiled, and said he was her favorite, which surprised the man. Blushing slightly, the girl cleared her throat and later added that it would be better for Adelphus to be reborn as a human rather than a god. Even for that, there were 3 conditions. The man asked what they were. The first condition said that after reincarnation, a man must not commit god-defying acts. The second required that at the end of his second life he become a full-fledged god, and Adelphus agreed to both conditions. The third condition, more a display of parental care, was that the goddess wanted to warn her beloved child. Before reincarnation, a man must train in heaven because without careful preparation, the monster of disaster cannot be defeated. After that, he said if it would help him become stronger, let everything be as it should be. The goddess who opened the gates warned that time passes differently in heaven and on earth. Before reincarnation, a man must reveal all his hidden abilities. From that moment on, Adelphus trained with many gods, and time passed more slowly than he had ever imagined. 100 years later, a boy stood in a house, peering intently at something. A descendant of a distant relative of Adelphus Worms, the boy was named Will Worms and was only 8 years old. The boy was washing the windows and said he remembered his past life last month when he turned 8. Remembering that the goddess told him that, as an apostle of the gods, he should behave with dignity, he now serves God as a novice like the apostle the girl mentioned. Will realized that if he started training now, he would be ready to defeat the disaster monster when it was reborn, and his training with the gods had sharpened his skills and taught him many effective methods. As the boy talked about having time to train and clean, the young man attacked him, saying Will had been cleaning for too long. Danon was a scion of the Worms family's main line and was 15 years old, while the young man beside him, Ivan, was a 12-year-old scion. They didn't like Will and laughed at him. Will could not tell where the Worm family's main line came from, because in his previous life he had no children. The boy ignored the attacks and said he would finish cleaning soon and leave. The men are descendants of Edelfest's cousin, and after that man's death, their branch became the main one, so they now brag that they are nobility despite making no effort to earn it. And Diana had always disliked the way the boy looked at him. Danon always treated the boy badly because he did not like having someone like him around. And by doing as he pleased, he made clear that Will's place in his house would never change. Both men made every effort to show the boy who was in charge. They were not even embarrassed by the servants who saw everything. One of the men who worked at the Worm's house asked Mr. Dane to stop, because if he kept going, Mr. Will could die from the pain. The young man ignored the servant and only told him not to call Will master, because that put them on the same level, which Danon disliked. The man wished Will had never existed, but Will didn't care because Danon hadn't scratched him. So to keep the servants calm, he decided it was time to end the ritual. He decided to let him do what he wanted, knowing he would calm down afterward and it would all be over. After we apply a magical shield to the part of the face Danon was aiming at, we'll pull the body aside at the right moment. In the next moment, the boy's body shot away, not because of Danon, but because of a carefully planned move by Will himself to ruin the man's act. The boy moaned as he acted out the scene while Danon felt proud of his strength and Ivan praised his brother and called him great. Leaving, the older brother kicked the bucket the boy was using to clean and laughed. The younger brother ordered everything removed at once, and Will bowed, saying he would do it. Servants hurried to Will to check on the boy, and to their surprise, the boy was completely unharmed. The man who had stood up for Will could not believe it, and asked how this was possible. Will said his father had taught him fighting techniques, so after those scuffles he came out unhurt and barely shaken, which surprised the servants but also put them a little at ease. Remembering the boy's parents, the servants realized this was expected from the son of Mr. Cludia and Mrs. Maria, who were skilled in martial arts. To help the boy, the man told him to leave the unfinished work to them because the gentleman was unlikely to return, and when the boy tried to refuse, he was cut off and told to look after his child's health. The man was kind and wanted Will to avoid constant hard work, so he persuaded him to rest. A moment later, a nearby voice called to the boy. Soraya, Will's younger sister, entered the room riding her pet Rune, and Will lifted her into his arms, asked if she had behaved, and she said she had. After giving the pet attention, Will patted him on the head and said he was a good boy too. Will thanked the woman who had always helped the boy look after his younger sister, and the old lady replied that she was only happy because the girl was the daughter of Mr. Klugia and Mrs. Maria. The woman described Mr. Klugio as an outstanding person, extremely talented, and a truly magical leader. Another girl who served in the worm's household said it would be better if Mr. Klugio were their master, but the woman cut her off. The old lady warned them to be careful with their words because nothing would hide from the gentleman. The girl immediately apologized. They just looked out the window and remembered that their parents had died 2 years ago. The boy had heard rumors that his father and uncle had long argued over who would be head of the household, and as a result my uncle married a woman from an influential family, took charge, and sent my father to a remote estate. My father fell defending the people of his lands from magical monsters. A grave was built for him, and the inscription, besides noting his estate, called him an outstanding leader. The children could no longer stay there or return to their uncle's house, and were taken into the care of the head of the House of Worms. In this house, Will and Saria are forced into hard work and are barely fed, and Will recently regained memories of his past life, but he would not run away because he could not leave his younger sister here. We also thought about whether his former students would accept him if they discovered who he was. After his mentor's death, his students formed the Council of Sages, which works to keep monsters from returning to the human world, and it is said they run an organization more powerful than the king in the church. A century ago, Edelphus's students were 20, so it was not surprising they were still alive. The boy asked how to contact the founders of the Council of Sages. The man said even their master could not do that. The servant explained that if the children attend a school for heroes and achieve outstanding grades, they could join the mission. The boy did not know which school he meant, so the man said it had been founded by the Council of Sages to train the next generation of heroes. The old lady said the entrance exam was very difficult, but if Mr. Will passed and enrolled, the school would pay all the costs and the children could live together in a dormitory. The woman said that even if you do not get into the School of Heroes, you can try taking the exams for another school, such as the School of Sages or the School of Knights. The boy considered it. From his past life experience, both the Sage School and the Knight School had been available only to the elite, and now he saw them as backup options. A voice calling him roused Will from his reverie. The servants had heard what the woman told the boy, so a man asked whether the master would take the School of Heroes exam, and another maid said she was sure the boy could pass the selection. Will felt a little embarrassed. It wasn't yet a question of whether he would pass. First, he needed to focus and decide whether it was worth taking the exam. The boy asked about age limits, and the man said there usually are none, but since all intelligent beings are humanoid, life expectancy varies by race. Many graduates of the Sages and Knight schools attend the School of Heroes, so it includes both very young and older students. Will considered how to get the head of the house's permission to take the exam, since Dan and Ivan would probably try to stop him. The man quickly reassured the boy. The servant said admission needs only the applicant's consent, even for a child, and no one will oppose the mission organization that runs the school, which set the rule to protect against outside influence. The man promised the servants would try to bring the application forms to the boy so the other gentlemen would not suspect anything. Will felt a little nervous because he had not expected such zeal from them. After solving the problem, Will looked at the sparkling clean window and said he had been sitting a little too late, so it was time for him to do something. The boy turned to the servants and asked them to look after his younger sister again, and the servants agreed and told him to rely on them. Turning to his sister, he will ask her to behave properly and will also ask their pet to watch over the little mistress. After saying goodbye to Saria and Rune, Will hurried to attend to his other business. Going outside, the boy walked through the crowd, thinking they had not been fed properly at home again, and was even willing to catch a bird for dinner so his sister would not be hungry. At the corner of the next house, we found a suitable spot and saw an empty doorway with the castle walls nearby. Standing by the castle wall, Will focused his magic in his legs to try to leap over the fence. The boy jumped over the wall and went unnoticed because the nearby guard at his post was asleep. Once across, Will landed hard, rolled over, and ran into the forest, finding not a single scratch, proof of his training with the gods. When he reached his destination, he saw a bird in the sky that he had to hunt. So he took a small stone in one hand and focused, channeling the right amount of magic into his thumb. The boy locked onto his target and steadied his magic to avoid missing. A moment later, Will threw a stone at a bird in the sky and hit it dead on. The duck began to fall. When Will fell, he saw the duck was dead and realized hunting was good practice for his skills. Imagining his younger sister would be happy when he brought home food because she loves poultry. A shout pulled Will out of his thoughts. He thought someone nearby was fighting because the noise sounded like a struggle. The sounds made it clear a battle was nearby. The girl beside the wounded fighter was nervous and tried to help, and a man with a sword faced 3 opponents. Very nervous. He wasn't sure he could fend off the attackers because there were several times as many of them. The man told the girl to leave so she could get away unharmed while he stayed to face the attackers, but she said if she left the team, no one would be able to cure them. He said this was exactly what their rivals wanted, so he avoided attacking them directly to make them pause for a while. We'll stay on the sidelines while the girl tries to reason with a team member, because if that was the opponent's plan, the team would be useless without her healing. The boy saw the brave warrior and noted he was not the type to flee the battlefield. Yet even with that courage, he could not handle 3 opponents. The 9 people lying nearby were clearly the man's fallen companions. People called for the girls to heal them, and Will wondered why the enemy was not attacking to stop their escape. The boy realized it could not be that simple. The girl helping her team was attacked from behind the next moment and could not dodge. The man rushed in and drove off the attacker, saving the terrified girl. But things were not going as we had hoped. Moments later, an attacker hit the man in the back. He had no time to defend himself or his team and needed help. Will kept watching as the lone man on the battlefield fought to stay on his feet. It looked like a pack of wolves attacking a single bear. The man kept urging the girl to leave, saying the capital was very close and the healer should have gone to call for help, but she refused. The warrior persuaded the healer that running was the safest choice and ordered her to go without looking back. The girl gave up and followed the order. Staying behind, the man protected the wounded and himself from the attackers, while the crying girl ran to call for help. The team's enemies saw the healer heading for the capital and moved to stop her, planning another attack from behind. The man fended off another attack and urged the girl to trust him, since her main goal was to reach the city. The girl sensed danger and turned just as an enemy tried to strike the warrior from behind. As the healer had warned, no one had time to act, because Will, tired of watching the injustice, stepped in to help the team and struck an opponent who was about to attack the warrior. Neither the man nor the girl had expected this because they had no idea anyone was nearby, and they stared at the boy who had come to their aid. One opponent fell to the ground and could not get up. The boy looked serious because he wanted to help people in trouble. Will said that although he did not fully understand what was happening, he would side with the minority and help them. The man immediately asked who the boy was. Will did not brag and, smiling, said he was just an ordinary 8-year-old passing by. The boy quickly told the girl she no longer needed to be distracted and could keep treating those who could no longer fight. Will assured everyone they did not need to worry because no one would be able to stop them in the near future. At the same time, an opponent tried to attack the boy but failed. Will intercepted the attacker's arm and threw him to the ground. Confident of his superiority, he said he would not let anyone approach the girl. One by one, a boy defeated the enemies after coming to the aid of people attacked by a gang of bandits. The enemy leader watched his men fall to the little boy and could not believe it. A moment later, as the leader was distracted, Will stabbed him through his mask. Will's blow split the skull masks, and one opponent even lost a tooth. After taking care of the leader, the boy heard fighting from the other side. He watched how the man also managed to beat the opponents. Tying up his rivals, the warrior thanked Will for helping him a lot. Will replied only that he was happy to help their team. The boy did not think he had done anything unusual, so a simple thank you felt right to him. Later, he watched a girl treating one of the injured. The healer looked exhausted, sweat beading on her face, so we suggested the girl herself needed treatment, but she protested and refused help. Seeing her teammates' condition, she chose not to treat herself, and instead quickly healed those who had been lying on the ground for a long time. Will decided to help again because the healer could not have done it alone, so he asked her to give him the problem, and the girl looked surprised as his palms lit up. The boy spread his arms wide and began chanting a spell to heal the warriors wounded in battle. When the spell finished, a large seal appeared on the ground, enclosing all the fallen warriors. Both the man and the girl watched the boy with interest and surprise, since he was so young and already had such powerful skills. Will kept his focus, and after a while the same seal appeared in his eye as it had on Earth. Continuing to whisper, the boy made the people around him burst into a soft light like tiny flames, and they did not burn but instead glowed with vitality. The healer looked at her hands and was surprised to find she was already fully healed. Her wounds had closed, and she felt much better. Nearby warriors still lay with their eyes closed, but the girl saw they already looked much better than before. While checking himself for injuries, the man said the boy's act was a miracle. The boy's skills not only protected and helped the team, but also fully healed all wounds and damage. Still in shock from what she had seen with her own eyes, the girl asked the boy how he had managed to heal everyone without touching anyone. Will said that if the girl practiced a lot, she would also succeed, and later he remembered one of his students, Dion, who also doubted himself because the healer had told her she would never succeed. Remembering briefly, Will said he had mastered the skill from the start and smiled. Later, seeing the girl's puzzled look, the boy regained his composure and asked her not to take his words seriously. The man standing next to him again said this would help the whole team, and he also healed them all, so he is their savior. Ending his monologue, the man offered the boy money to thank him, but the boy refused, saying he did not need it. The boy turned and said the team did not have to give him anything, then wished them a safe trip home and waved goodbye. As the boy walked away, the girl asked his name because the team did not even know who had saved them. Will refused to give his name or say why he was running, and shouted that he was not worthy of such an honor, and the man and the girl stood there, not yet grasping how remarkable the boy was. After a while we will hunt and walk home while he carries several captured birds on his back. Later the boy sped up and ran because he felt someone was chasing him. Picking up speed, he thought that would stop the pursuer, but he was wrong. The surveillance hadn't stopped, so Will halted and ordered his pursuer to show him the eyes. There was a stirring in the bushes. The boy dropped the prey from his back and readied himself to fight the attacker. To his surprise, a creature stood before him that looked neither intimidating nor threatening. We looked at his pursuer and couldn't understand why a slime-like creature was chasing him. The slime kept jumping from side to side and caught the man's attention, but the boy could not tell why it was following him. Moments later, the slime stopped and looked at Will, who was confused and thought the creature wanted to follow him. Will asked if the creature wanted to stay with him, and it nodded. He let the slime come along without thinking and told it to hide in his clothes so no one would see. The slime did not resist and, after hearing the man, slipped under the boy's shirt. The boy had meant a slightly different spot but said nothing and looked down. Now his shirt looks odd across the chest. People might wonder where the boy found the creature, since several heroes in the city walk with monsters, but he was only 8 years old. Will returned and went straight to the Worms family's stable because his younger sister loved spending time there. Will was the only one who lived in the stable all the time. He had grown used to it and thought it was not such a bad place, especially with pleasant neighbors. Going up to the horses, he stroked them and asked if they were behaving well. Later, the younger sister arrived at the stable, riding her pet and accompanied by the elderly maid who cared for her. Will lifted his sister into his arms and asked if she was okay because she was supposed to be on vacation with her grandmother in a completely different place. Apologizing to the boy, the woman said, Saria only wanted to be with her brother today, so she asked the boy to come to the stable and will go see his sister to check if that is true. A little embarrassed, the girl looked down. Her cheeks flushed, but she asked Will if she could spend time with her brother. Will thought for a moment and said it was okay. He will apologize to the old lady because his younger sister kept bothering her, but the woman said it was no burden to look after the girl and she would come back tomorrow to pick her up. The girl was upset by what she heard, and the boy, ending his conversation with the woman, said he was unlikely to be in the stable at that time again. Later, the animals began acting oddly, constantly sniffing the boy, but he was worried about his younger sister's drooping appearance, so he asked if something had happened. Later, Rune barked loudly at something ahead, which made Saria a little nervous. The pet squeezed between the brother and sister and sniffed the boy. Will could not understand why the pet was acting so strangely. Suddenly, the creature began moving wildly under his shirt. Then it jumped out from his clothes, surprising the boy. Will saw the dog had already started playing with the slime, which did not like what was happening. Will said he needed to hide the creature and tell the pet not to touch it. At first, Saria was a little confused and shocked when she saw the slime, but her eyes soon lit up because she really liked the creature, and the girl said it looked like jelly. Cradling her new friend, Saria pressed her face to him and said he was very cute. The slime enjoyed it, but when she hugged a bit tighter, he began to change shape. The boy was glad his sister liked her new friend, but he warned her not to tell anyone the slime was here. She promised to keep the secret and kept hugging the jelly. Remembering why the boy had gone outside the walls of the city, we suggested his sister go out to eat because not far from the loot, there were also sandwiches from the woman looking after the girl. Later, the younger sister thanked her brother for the tasty treat Will had made on the stove with his own hands, and he thanked her for her help. After changing clothes, the boy said there was a blanket in the stable. Then their pet brought it and covered the girl lying on it, and my brother worried that Saria might freeze. The younger sister was not cold because the dog beside her was very warm, and sleepy she closed her eyes and smiled slightly. Lying beside his sister, Will asked whether anything was worrying her, whether their new father had scolded her, and whether she had behaved well while he was away. Saria hugged the blanket and looked sad again because her older brother would soon leave to study at the academy. Will didn't know his little sister was upset, and suggested the servants might have told her about his plans to study at the School of Heroes. The boy reassured Saria not to worry, because when he joined the academy, both she and Rune would be with him. Saria did not believe him at first and was afraid her brother would leave her alone. Still, Will dissuaded his younger sister. Hugging her, he said he wanted to see how well Saria would do at the academy, and she said she would try her best. After a while lying together, Will said it was time for Saria to go back to her grandmother, and his younger sister promised to behave. 3 days later, the boy was doing his usual cleaning chores, even though the servants had told him he did not have to every day. While cleaning the toilet, he kept thinking that since his memory of his previous life returned, he had begun training even during chores. Magic power in Will's body circulated as the magic charge was applied and moved opposite his body's motion. The exercise strengthened both his muscles and his magic control. Will cleaned with his bare hands at his brother's command for extra training, but his palms stayed clean because he covered them with a thin magical film. It was a valuable practical exercise. Noise from the rooms next to the toilet pulled him out of his thoughts, and he turned to hear what the people were arguing about. Ivan and Danan were making noise. The older brother told someone the action was too selfish, and the younger brother said that although they were in the rescue squad, all the brothers were from the Worms family. The girl the boys complained to ignored their complaints and said they could go to the head of the family with them. Danan said that while the head of the family was away, he was running the estate. The girl stopped listening to the men and asked the maid where Will Worms was, and the maid said he had been invited to the second floor. Footsteps sounded near the toilet, indicating someone was coming. After opening the doors, a boy sat in front of the girl, who was cleaning and clearly had not expected anyone to visit him. The girl looked at the child and asked if he was the willworm she had been looking for. The boy stood up to answer the girl politely, said she had found the one she needed, and asked why she was looking for him. Bowing to Willing's greeting, the girl said she was with the rescue squad, and had come to tell the boy that the Hero Academy entrance exam was tomorrow. Dane and Kirste did not understand why his relative, whom he disliked so much, applied for the entrance exam without even telling his brothers, and Will merely thought the application had been delivered successfully since they had come to him. The boy asked why the girl had come to tell him the news in person, and she said she always does that when she senses something is wrong. A member of the rescue squad looked at the men standing behind, which made them a little nervous. The girl was silent again and told the boy to hurry after her. Will agreed to follow the girl, but Denon did not like being ignored. As the boy and the girl walked away, the young man attacked a rescue team member from behind, saying she would not get away with treating him that way. She turned, touched his fist with her index finger, and he jolted as if electrocuted. Denai had not expected this because no one in his house had the right to refuse him, and his face twisted in confusion and pain while Will watched and was slightly surprised. The boy noticed the girl had excellent magic because she stopped a punch with one finger, and she looked at Denian threateningly, saying that if he behaved like that, she would regard it as betrayal. Danan collapsed to the ground, terrified and crying, and decided to ask if he could take his younger sister with him to the academy. Walking past the servants, the girl said the boy could do it because relatives and pets are allowed to stay in the academy dorm during exams and he can bring the slime. A servant from the Worm's household said she would fetch his younger sister for the boy, and Will barely had time to thank her. A rescue team member noticed a young man still sitting on the floor who said irritably that he would also take the entrance exam. She told the young man he didn't need to be shy about doing what he wanted. Bowing respectfully, she said the Hero Academy is always ready to accept applications from anyone who wants to enroll and study. On her way to the academy, Saria was delighted to be riding in a carriage, enjoying the trip and one horse in particular that would pull it. Saria stared out the window to look at something else that seemed interesting, but her older brother told her not to lean so hard on the glass. Later, he was pulled away from his younger sister by a nearby girl calling to him. We looked back and saw his pet sniffing a rescue team member. The boy told Run to stop because it embarrassed the girl, but she didn't mind and said everything was fine. Blushing, the girl covered her mouth with a scarf and after a pause asked if she could pet someone else's pet. Will cheered up and let the girl do what she wanted because his pet clearly did not mind being petted. The girl was glad to pet another person's dog, which was very fond of her, and a member of the rescue team said their dog was very big and decided to tell a short story about how he came to them. Run wandered into their garden as a puppy on the boy's birthday, so the dog was the same age as Will and still growing. Later, the girl noticed the boy's younger sister staring at her, so she asked if something had happened to Story Alums. The girl stared at the rescue team member because she wanted to know her name. Saria set an example and introduced herself to her, even though she already knew the name of Will's younger sister. Clearing her throat, she apologized for not introducing herself sooner, and said she had simply forgotten and couldn't find the right moment. A rescue squad member patted the girl on the head and said her name was Artie, or formerly Artie Zine on Barling. Saria seemed not to be listening to the girl's words and stared at her again without breaking eye contact. Feeling embarrassed by the close attention, Artie pulled back, and Saria quickly said the girl had very beautiful hair, which explained why she had been staring, and later the girl also said Artie's eyes were very beautiful. A rescue team member blushed deeply as the girl stepped closer and hugged her. Run looked moved and started rubbing against the two girls. Later, Will asked the girl how she knew his brothers would let him take the entrance exam. I already replied that the person who brought the application asked to make sure nobody stopped the boy from doing it. They will immediately realize the man who worked at the Worm's house had helped him. Because his brothers might learn of his kindness, the servants could expect some kind of reward, so the boy grew increasingly worried about them. Seeing Will's puzzled look, Artie quickly told him there was nothing to worry about. The Academy will not disclose that information at the request of anyone submitting an exam application. The boy relaxed a little when he heard this and said it encouraged him. Near the end of the journey, Saria looked out the carriage window and called her brother to see what she had found. She said they had arrived. The window revealed a large building, the Academy of Heroes. When the carriage stopped, Run and Saria ran straight out toward the building, and the Curl was delighted by how large the nearby structure was. Will warn his younger sister and call after her to slow down so she does not fall, and Artie then said she would lead the group to their new dorm room. The boy, his younger sister, and their pet were assigned room 401. As promised, the siblings were already escorted to their new room and told that if Will passed the entrance exam, they could stay there forever. After handing the keys to the boy, the girl said she would show them the children's room later, where Will could take Saria while he studied. The boy did not expect the academy to have such facilities, and Artie explained that, because many students have children, the academy set up specially equipped rooms to give parents peace of mind. Artie said children also learn in those rooms, but the lessons fit their age. Some kids are younger than Saria, and some are even older than Will. After Artie finished, the boy said it was odd because the children's ages varied so much and some could even be older than Will. The girl agreed. Hero Academy brings together the world's most talented creatures, and provides canteens, a training center, dormitories, and very comfortable living conditions for its students. Now we will see why the academy was built outside the capital. Because it was close to the capital, the School of Heroes contained many buildings on its grounds. Realizing how he and his sister were being treated in their new place, he decided he had to take the exam at all costs, so he and Saria could stay in the dorm and not learn more about what happened to them in the worm's house. She has already taken her brother and sister to the place where Soria will be staying, while Will is busy studying. After waving goodbye to her older brother, the girl stayed with the tutor. It turned out the place Soraya would be staying had servants who were also cared for by the academy, which surprised Will, and Artie said the hero school was responsible too. Walking down the corridor, the girl decided to say she had been told about Will Worm's ignorance, how the academy was organized, and how its entrance exams were run. In his previous life, there was no academy, and his family worked all day, so he had little contact with the outside world, and in this life, his knowledge was still limited. As they walked down the hall, Artie asked the boy if he had checked his favorability level with the guardian deity, but Will did not know what that meant. The girl said the technique was created by a great sage on the Council of Sages. Will still couldn't figure out who they meant. Arda said the great sage is a student of Adelphus Worms, specifically Milt Edelweiss. On hearing this, the boy felt proud of his former student, because Milt had not only managed to get a surname, but had also developed a new technique without his mentor's help. Will also decided to ask why Milk was called the Great Sage rather than, for example, the Great Sage. The girl said Adolphus, who warmed himself, was posthumously called the Great Sage. The boy did not expect he would have that nickname. Later, the boy asked who the guardian deities were. Artie answered what she was thinking when she heard about them. Every human has a guardian deity. A guardian deity is a human god who leads an entire race, and sometimes gods protect not only humans, but also other creatures. The most famous of these exceptions is a member of the purchasing council, Dion, who is the favorite of the god of water. When Will heard the name of another former student, he could not recall whether the boy had a last name like Milt's. Maybe it came from the boy's previous life. Deities bless people with powers that reflect their patrons, and those who enjoy the greatest favor are the god's favorites. That is why someone whose god is a mere human is simple. After being told everything the boy had asked her, they reached the room where the seal was. Inside the room was a device that measured the god's favor. Reading a book nearby, the girl approached the magic ball and told Will to put his hand on the crystal. The check required no preparation, so she said he could start right away. He put his hand on the ball. Remembering who the boy really was, he recalled the gods he had often trained with, and after being reborn, Adelphus became a boy named Will while remaining an apostle who had trained under many gods. Closing his eyes, the boy felt certain that many of those deities would guard him. Artie interrupted Will to say the measurement was over and he could remove his hand from the crystal. Will looked at his hands and felt nothing. Someone already checked the boy and asked if he was okay. The boy said everything was fine and asked what the book's inscription said about which deity was his patron. The girl turned the pages and read that the patron saint of Will Worms was apparently just a human deity, and the boy was surprised because he had not expected that. Regaining his composure, the boy asked the girl if the human god was his only guardian, and she answered yes, which displeased him. Feeling a little strange, Will decided to ask whether anyone had lost consciousness while using the measuring device. Having checked the book and thought for a moment, she replied that, as far as she knew, there had never been such cases. Will felt a little hurt because he had trained with the gods for so long before being reborn, and he assumed they all liked him. Though they were always friendly, none of them would be his patron. The boy found this hard to accept. 10 seconds later, Artie asked Will to place his hand on the crystal again while she kept her palm on a page of the book. He obeyed. Calmer this time, he closed his eyes for a while, and when he opened them, he found himself in a completely different place. Looking around, he saw a large room with tall columns standing both in front and behind. Looking up, Will assumed he was in the world of the gods. When a girl saw the boy, she came up behind him and asked what had happened. The girl was the same goddess who had met the boy before his rebirth. The goddess asked if this boy was really Edel, and he replied that in the current situation he was Will. Later, other gods learned Adelphus had joined the couple and approached to greet the boy, which annoyed the goddess. The gods made a fuss and asked the boy why he was there. Some thought he had died a second time and come back to them, but the boy said he was alive and now went by a different name. The goddess tried to wake all the gods who gathered around the boy and asked Will what had happened to him in the first place. The boy asked if they had been watching him lately. One by one, the gods admitted they were truly watching what Will was doing in the human world. When no one paid attention to the goddess's calming actions, she became angry and said it was pissing her off. After she spoke, the girl cast a spell that silenced everyone, and the gods could only mumble in confusion. The goddess asked the boy how he had reached the gods, and Will did not know how to answer. Later, all the gods left, leaving Will alone with the goddess, and they sat side by side as the girl asked again how the boy had arrived, but he did not know. To the gods, humans are like small ants. Feeding an insect on a whim does not mean a god takes an interest. A god is often not interested in human life, even if his beloved child lives in the human world. Still waiting for this boy's answer, the goddess realized he would not reply because he seemed lost in thought. Changing the subject, the goddess asked if Will really liked living alone. Will replied that he sometimes wondered how different the human world is from the world the girl lives in. The goddess closed her eyes and said that, as Will had said, their worlds were very different. She asked Will how he was after his rebirth, and he said he was fine. Will also decided to ask a question that had been on his mind about what would have happened if he had died before he regained the memory of his previous life. The goddess said it could never happen, and the boy looked at the girl in surprise. Ugami, the dog god, approached the boy and the girl. The god said Laxanis was always watching over Will. The boy looked at the god and asked who Laxanis was and how he could keep an eye on him. The pet of the boy and his younger sister, Rune, turned out to be a divine child of the Lixanes. Will was surprised because he had always thought his dog was completely ordinary. In Ugun, he said he was a deity named Luxanis, who sent his child to Earth when Will Worms was born, and the goddess added that she had asked him to do it. God revealed that Rune has no memory of the divine world because he was sent to Earth as a puppy, but he shares the same magic as Lexana, and his mission is to always help and protect Will. The boy said his pet seemed more like a friend than a guard, because it was smart, kind, and took great care of his little sister, and Inugami smiled, understanding his child really was a friendly creature. The god stroked the boy's head and noted that he knew how Rune was getting along with Will. Later, Laxana said he was also very happy to meet the boy in person. The god of dogs said that although the boy did not remember it, he was the one who named Lixonis Rune's child, and did not really remember that day. Inugami said it was true because when the puppy first met the child, the boy called him that name right away, so they kept it. Another goddess interrupted the conversation, called to the boy, and said she was also sending her child to the human world. Will turned and saw the slime goddess on the ground, who added that he looked very cute. After the hunt, a slime goddess joined the boy and later played with his younger sister, saying Saria is much better at choosing names than her older brother. Will didn't fully understand what the gods meant, so he simply thanked them. The gods thought the boy was a bit silly. Later, we thought about it and asked the gods whether their children who lived in the human world also had divine powers. Lixanis said it was not that simple. Some are ordinary mortals or children, and others are demigods. Like the Inugami, a deity's children are ordinary dogs. Some demigods are protected by guardians and possess magic. Both Rune and the slime called Fury were demigods with unusual abilities. Waiting for the dog god to finish, the goddess asked how much longer he would chat. The girl wanted to ask the boy questions too, but Lexana said he wasn't finished. The goddess wanted to ask how the boy had lived in recent years, but she had no time because they began to fade, which surprised the girl, and the boy apologized, realizing his time in the gods' world was probably over. The dog. God said he would always watch over Will, and the slime god added that Fury and his sister would also be by his side. The boy thanked everyone for their concern, and the god tried to say something, but there was little time. The girl wanted to share details about Will's life as a human and his future as a god. The girl had no time to speak. We looked up and wondered what the goddess wanted to tell him. The boy felt eyes on him, turned, and saw Artie looking at him, clearly wanting to say something too. She decided to unload all the exam information and other small details on the boy, and said that to master her specialty and pass the exam they needed to inspect the temple. After telling him so much, the girl asked if he understood everything. Will looked at her and did not know what to say. Later, he simply thanked Artie and promised to do everything he could to pass the exam. The girl was pleased by his attitude. When he left the room, we decided to ask him if he could find out in advance what the entrance exams would cover, and Artie replied that they would be divided into written and practical parts. The girl said there are several kinds of practical exams. If the boy scores high, he can be sure he passed. Those blessed by the deity are seen as more fortunate. Will asked Artie if she had a guardian deity. Artie said her guardian was the god of the sword. Will remembered that god as a strong man. The boy pointed out that despite her youth, she was already a member of the rescue squad. But he added that she was not an assistant because she had recently passed the tests to join. The gods who he had unwittingly visited only recently watched the couple as they walked and talked, and when asked how she had already achieved such success, she said she had trained hard and was eager to join the squad. The god of the sword, guardian of Will, could not understand why the boy refused to trust his mentors. The other god also demanded that he return and explain himself to them. The goddess could not help because she did not expect him back so soon and would have no time to tell him anything. The flame god told everyone to calm down. The deity turned to the god of lies because the god's child had made the device that caused the problem. That made Will wary of all the deities now. The genie, the god of lies, defended his child, insisting the device was not so bad. The problem was that humanity simply did not know about the apostles, so the gods were powerless. Another god asked why the device could not measure their strength and identified the apostles. The flame god briefly doubted he was really speaking to a deity like himself at that moment. Only the dog god recently explained the difference between children and demigods, and the man who remembered the explanation seemed to understand it. God still did not understand the connection between them and Will, and the flame god grew very angry and tried to explain everything again. Reborn after a deal with God, Will is an unusual child, and God asked whether he was branded a divine prisoner, and whether he was the same as Rune and Fury. The god of flame claimed he was the child of the supreme god and the guardian princess, and the apostle was a demigod with magical powers. Will, blessed by God, was now God's messenger. The man tried to explain that the apostles were demigod beasts, and that Will was one of them because he shared the demigod guardian's magic, but the god of flame interrupted and said he had mixed everything up again. The god of flame said they were talking about a device made for mortals, and that she could not measure a god's power. After thinking for a while, the man said everything was clear to him, but the god of flame did not believe him and was sure the deity had understood nothing again. Looking at the boy again, the man revealed as the god of war said he did not expect Will to have any problems, since Will was his disciple. Other deities expected this because the boy was also a disciple of the god of flame, the god of lies, and the god of the sword. The goddess argued with another deity about how they would need to send another demigod beast to help. The goddess Flame noted that such guardianship would only cause problems. After the conversations and checks, Will go back for his younger sister, who was playing with a doll near the other children. When her older brother waved, Saria was relieved he had come back to pick her up. She waved back, but a boy running with a friend rushed past and accidentally bumped into her. Saria was badly hurt and rubbed her head in pain while staring at the floor as tears ran down her cheeks, so focused on the pain that she did not notice a vase falling from the pedestal onto her. Seeing this, Artie moved to warn the girl so she could dodge the falling object, but before she could speak, Will was already running. Artie barely blinked as the vase shattered, but the girl was gone, and only toys lay among the broken pieces. Artie stared in disbelief as everything unfolded in an instant. She could barely make out the older brother lifting the younger sister into his arms and carrying her away. Artie watched as the girl caring for the children ran toward her brother and sister, and could not understand how she had covered that distance so quickly while carrying a girl in her arms. A rescue team member didn't even notice the boy rush to help his younger sister, and Will exhaled as he checked that Saria was okay. The girl apologized for causing a vase to break. The boy who had accidentally pushed Saria cried and asked everyone to forgive him, and Artie calmed the children, saying nothing terrible had happened. Artie stood before a huge door, unable to step inside. She rested her hand on her sword's scabbard and stayed where she was. The doors lit up and began to open. Artie looked surprised and stood still. An unexpected voice told the girl to go inside. Then Artie went into the room and told the girl she had just returned. The girl heard her. Zenobia Barren was a member of the Council of Swordsmen, and she kept reading the documents as magic seeped from her fingertip, asking Artie how everything had gone and whether Will Worm had proved himself. Artie said his behavior was nothing like an 8-year-old's, that he was wise for his age and strong enough. Zenobia Edelbearing rose from her desk, closed her eyes, and said she understood everything. The girl then began circling her desk, thinking hard about something. She looked very interested and put her hand to her chin while someone nearby watched carefully. Zenobia et al. Barring interrupted Artie's thoughts and said the only guardian deity of Will Worms is the human god. Zenobia Edelbarring fell silent, looked at Artie, and asked whether Artie was telling the truth. Artie agreed. Zenobia Edelbarring kept pondering. She lifted her head and said she was very curious about the reason. Confused by Zenobia Edelbarring, Artie asked about it. Zenobia said there was nothing like that, and then asked if Artie had anything else. Artie paused with her hand on her chin, wondering if she had anything else but unable to make sense of that phrase. Looking at Zenobia Adele Barring, she wondered what the girl was up to, and if she wanted to talk, because Zenobia Adele Barring was sweating profusely. Zenobia. Edel paused, put her hands on Artie's shoulders, and exhaled. She asked Artie to listen. The girl said she did not want any questions yet, but asked whether anyone had noticed changes in Will's behavior and said he might be acting strangely. Artie looked away and said he had asked her if anyone had lost consciousness while using a measuring device, and Zenobia and the others tried to block out thoughts of the girl's words. Zenobia et al. Barring reconsidered what the young man meant and realized she urgently needed to consult Milt. Zenobia Edelbearing said that if Will's guardian deity is only a god, he probably has no abilities or magic, and asked Artie what she thought. Artie recalled a few points and stated clearly that Will has a natural talent. Zenobia Adele Barring looked surprised. She said that if that was the case, Artie should keep watching Will. Artie said she understood. Then Zenobia Adele Barring drew one of the wooden swords. The girl swung and hung in midair. I already felt a strong gust of wind. Zenobia Adele Barring asked Artie if she wanted to ask anything else. Artie asked why the girl told her to bring Will Worms. Startled, Zenobia Adele Barring asked Artie if she truly understood why they were doing this. Artie replied that they must not allow riots. Zenobia Edelbarring noticed something, looked at Artie, and said it was not very convincing. Artie apologized. Zenobia Edelbarring stopped her and said everything was fine and the girl had the right to think so. Suddenly, Artie brings up Will Worms and the disaster monster and asks if it is connected to Tin Ebrus, shocking Zenobia Edelbarring. I already said Zenobia Edelbarring told her to watch Will last time, and she asked whether it had anything to do with the disaster monster. She said she believes sabotage is what Tenebrous really fears. Zenobia Edelbarring stopped the girl and called her name. She asked Artie why she had decided that. Artie fell silent and looked at the floor. The girl said plainly that the Salvation Army was an organization created to fight cults, and she thinks it makes sense these thoughts came to her because Zenobia Edelbarring told her to keep an eye on this boy. If he truly has ties to the gods, the cult will see him as a threat and try to destroy him. Now she understands why it bothers her so much. Artie felt tense, but she asked Zenobia Edelbarring who it really was. Zenobia Edelbarring said the girl's name and moved closer to her face. Zenobia Adele wore a padded cap and said she was quick-witted and could immediately grasp the essence of their mission. Turning away, she said there were reasons she could not tell Artie anything yet, but she would find out soon, and Artie tensed and agreed. Saying goodbye, she apologized and left the room. Zenobia Edelbarring set down her wooden sword and decided the catastrophe's monster could simply be called a Tenebris. A cult is a secret group that fiercely worships the beast of disaster, also called the god of disasters. They believe they can bring the beast back and become the strongest race, and this could happen soon. Zenobia Edelbarring says it is necessary to act quickly to gather an army of skilled warriors and others who can resist the beast. She pulls out a packet that measures a person's magical power, attached to the admission application, She built it to find the people she needed quickly, but almost no one met the requirements. Will Worms met those requirements, but the girl still did not know who he was. Right now, Will is sitting in the room and sighing heavily. He believes the number of guardian deities isn't counted in the entrance exam results. Artie said, if a guardian deity merges with a human, it loses focus. If he fails, he can return safely to his hometown and resume a quiet life, and he should have enough money for living expenses and food to get Saria back on her feet. Saria asks her brother what happened and whether he is hungry, and Will looks surprised. He agrees and says he is a little hungry right now. Surya tells her brother she will give him some food. She handed him a piece of dried meat and told him to eat. We realized she was giving him the jerky he had received from his vassals. When they lived in the city, they couldn't get decent food. Sometimes the vassals shared with them. Saria kept a piece of dried meat because she knew what hunger was and feared it. Will asked Saria if she was hungry, but she said no. She said she'd had a bite to eat, and then her stomach suddenly rumbled. Will thank his sister for the meat, Sirius smiled. Will took a bite of the meat and said it was delicious, which made her very happy. He wanted to tell the girl something, so he said there was a lot of food in the kitchen. Soria was surprised. Will also said that she could take it whenever she wanted, which surprised her even more. Will told Saria not to keep food in her pocket anymore, and he knows it wasn't easy for her. Saria smiled and said she was fine because he was always with her. Relief came knowing they would no longer have to starve or worry about Syria. He told her to go to the kitchen and eat. She still couldn't get over the shock. Later, Syria ate a tasty meal in the kitchen. She could not believe she could eat such delicious food, but Will told her she could eat as much as she wanted. Eating enough will make her as strong and fast as her brother. Saria began eating the food. It tasted very good, and Will wiped her mouth with a napkin and asked her to eat more slowly. Later, Will looked around. He noticed almost no one was around. It was unclear whether any students remained or were out on field exercises. He realized he had signed up too, which raised some suspicions. He turns to Saria and asks her a question. She watches him with the spoon still in her mouth. He asks what happened after he arrived. Saria thought her brother was worried. We'll say everything was fine. He mentioned hearing sounds that make him uneasy and asked if Saria could talk about them. Sorry, everyone says she's fine and nothing will happen if she speaks up. Will praise the girl. She hugs the slime, smiles, and says she did a good job. Will suddenly decides to name the slime fury. Saria was surprised. We will stroke the slime and it will smile at him. Looking at her, he realized he must be very happy. Saria had called him Fury before, and he had grown used to that name, but now he wanted to make it official and claim his own name. He said he shouldn't mix up his name anymore because he keeps forgetting it. But he also thought there was nothing wrong with it. Saria called out to her brother. Saria hugged Fury tightly and kept repeating his name. Will said the girl had called him that, so he had already forgotten. Will realized that Fury liked his name and was thinking about its qualities. Fury also understood everything Will wanted to say. At last, he decided to name the slime Fury, and all three of them cheered and looked happy. In the school dorm, Will says he is ready. Saria wishes him luck, and then someone knocks at the door. Artie asked Will for permission to enter his room, and he agreed. Her cheeks flushed as she opened the door and stepped inside. She then asked if Will was ready to go out. Standing in front of Will, they discussed her going with him to the exam. He worried he might distract her from important tasks. She said she was completely free today. Rune, a big white dog, was licking Artie, and then a slug crawled onto her shoulder. We will wonder whether she could train him as an assistant or whether she would be allowed to accompany him to the exam. A slug sat on Artie's shoulder as she poked it with her finger. She then asked whether Will would take the rune exam. The rune and the slug. Will said the slug's name was Fury, which was his official name now. Will pointed to the side with Fury beside him. Artie said she wanted to ask Will to take the animals with him if possible, and he would agree to her request. Will watched Saria. She felt his gaze, blushed, and called his name. He had never left her alone before, and hoped nothing would happen while he was away. Will squat down in front of Saria and ask him to take the animals and let her stay alone while he is away. Saria blushed and said she could sit alone for a while. Will patted her on the head and thanked her, saying they would definitely go to dinner together when he returned. Saria agreed. Fury sat on Will's head. Saria held Artie's hand, and Artie stroked Rune's muzzle. saying she would take Saria to the nursery first, then they had to go to the entrance exam. In the middle of the street, Will, Artie, and Rune stood surrounded by a crowd. Artie said Will's exam would be held here and wished him luck. Will thanked her for coming with him. Will waved goodbye to Artie, while two dark-haired men, Dynan and Ivan, watched from behind as Artie sat beside him, and the men said Will and Artie had been arrogant. Danan approached Will, reached out to him, and shouted that Will had no right to ignore them. Rune stood behind Will, felt threatened, and began to growl. Onlookers were drawn to the young men's cries, waiting to see who would dare disobey the rightful heir of the Worms family. Dana heard people talking about the origins of the dark-haired heirs from wealthy families and laughed angrily. Will looked at the man in the hat who said nobles each have 4 guardian deities and frowned, realizing he had no idea who those men were or what they wanted from him. Denon said angrily that he hoped Will wouldn't run away, because ending up like this would be very sad, and it would hurt him if Will chickened out. While Will tried to calm the growling Rune and said Rune could harm the guys, Rune Grind kept growling louder and louder, and Will stood with his back to the men while one of them asked if he was listening to what was being said. Fury flared in Will's eyes as he turned half sideways and asked the others if they really thought he was a coward. They tensed slightly at his words. We turned around and started shouting that it was wrong to call him a coward. Those men were rude and ill-mannered. They should be quiet and stop dishonoring their family name. The men jumped back, clearly scared. Denon grew angry and began threatening Will, so Ivan told him to calm down. Ivan then approached Will and asked if we would also have a divine guardian like them. Will did not understand what that meant. Ivan stepped closer to Will and said that if Will's god could compete with theirs, the guys had 4 of them. A crowd stood behind Will, and someone said the information about the 4 guardians was true after all, but it was clear the men were from the Worms family. I approached Will and said he might answer them anyway. He closed his eyes, ready to start talking. The boys rested their hands on their belts and stood silently for a moment. Then malicious smiles spread across their faces. The noun put his hand to his ear, looked away, and said he still couldn't hear anything from Will. I stood next to him and said I was ready to repeat the question so Will would answer it anyway. Will sighed. Will stood in front of the men and said that if he had not already answered their question, they must have hearing problems. They were stunned by his response. One of the men loudly insulted Will's mother and told him to leave town immediately. Will was furious. Will put his hand behind his back and stood silent. Danan said Will is so afraid of being out that he can't even move. Anger filled Will's face as he suddenly pulled his hand from behind his back and lifted it. Dynan flinched, covering himself with his hand and stepping back. Will threw the glove into Danance's face, making him scream in fright. He then said he would never forgive him for insulting his mother. Danance covered his face with his hand. Danan held Will's glove and angrily accused Will of challenging him to a duel. Will shot back that Danan was afraid of an 8-year-old child with one deity. Ivan asked Will to repeat his words. Will then threw a second glove at Ivan's face. He said Ivan's actions were too predictable. Ivan trembled with fear. Will raised his hand and said the others only knew how to talk, so he challenged them to a duel. Anger flared among the men, and they insulted Will. Danan had an instant idea, and an evil smile crossed his face as he said that since Will had given them a choice, it was time to fight. Will was surprised to hear that. Danan gave a small look and said that if Will lost, he would have to grant Danan's wish. Will did not hear what the wish was, but agreed to the proposal. Danan was surprised by Will's quick agreement. Ivan started shouting that we could not stay calm because he would be easily defeated. Will lowered his head, closed his eyes and scratched his head, thinking Ivan was wrong and that he himself was confident in his abilities. Will raised his hand and pointed to himself, saying it was his turn to set the terms. If he won, the boys would visit his mother's grave and ask her forgiveness for insulting her. They listened in silence. Ivan threw back his head and laughed, and Denon sneered that Will had no chance of winning even if heaven and earth changed places. Will folded his arms across his chest, and the boys turned around when they heard the stranger. The stranger said the guy should start the duel because if they drag it out, they might not make it to the written exam. The stranger was an adult man, wearing a small hat and a scarf tied around his neck. He told them students may not duel without permission. The students looked at him suspiciously. We looked at the man and said he was not a student. The man replied that the rule applies to both candidates and students, so Will must also follow it. The Formas family said they were surprised by Will's fearlessness, since he wasn't even intimidated by their threats and he closed his eyes, ignoring the boy's words. The man raised a finger and said that since Will feared nothing, that man would become his duelist, and the others looked at him in surprise. The man opened one eye and said he wanted to join in too, and one of the guys asked him what they would do about the written exam in that case. Will kept ignoring the people around him. The man said it was getting late, and the written exam could wait. Will remembered his late mother's face and decided he could not take the exam until he had defended her honor. Will looked at the people around him and thought if he entered the academy, no family could threaten him anymore, and after this duel he would repay all his debts. The guys around him were even willing to be late for the exam to watch the fight. Will walked toward the Vormus family, Rune and the others trailing behind him, with his gaze fixed straight ahead and ready to defeat anyone. A man stood between Will and the Vormus family in a high-ceilinged room with large columns and said this was the place for their duel, so they could start the fight. A group of men stands in an arena divided into sectors. A large crowd surrounds the arena. A man says that if Will wins, the men must apologize to Will's late mother. If the men win, Will leave the arena and admit defeat. Will closed his eyes and dropped his hands to his belt, agreeing with the man. Dana smiled maliciously and suggested they start the fight. Ivan folded his hands across his chest and waited for the match to begin. The man looked at Will and said it wasn't fair that if the Vormus family lost, they wouldn't lose anything, and Will, without turning, said he didn't oppose that outcome, so it was fine. A rook with a fury on his head sat on the podium between a girl in a raincoat and a man in a protective suit. The man asked if Will could handle it since there were two men and he was alone. Will said he could handle it, and he was not alone. Wearing a hat, a man asked for a fair fight because Will was alone. Dynamics called back that they always prey on the weak, so they would take care of Will even faster. Twisting his face and sticking out his tongue, he thought he could deal with Will instantly and would not even have time to blink. The man replied that since everyone agreed to the terms and was ready for a duel, they should begin. The Vormus family's men crouched into fighting stances, ready to start the battle. Will stood before them, calm and confident of his victory. He turned, waved his hand, and said he hoped the fight would be quick. The man began swinging his hands in a half-crouch. Will stood motionless with his hands on his hips, whistling. Danon asked Will nervously what he was doing, but Will ignored him, found him too noisy, and said he had warned the guys before the fight that he would let them attack him first. The men started taunting Will, then cast spells and rushed into battle. They began to conjure, and magic symbols appeared before them. The Nand warned Will to prepare to face their full power. Will's legs glowed with magical energy, and he realized the man really had power. A large explosion erupted in front of the audience, and a cloud of dust filled the entire venue. The dusk cloud slowly fades, and the crowd is awed by the light and Danan's power. Danan spreads his arms and declares his strength cannot be defeated. Will moves behind him and says Danan is overconfident. Soon Will moves beside Danan and grabs his neck to practice a grappling technique, holding Danan's hand with one hand and his neck with the other. Will was sitting astride Danon and suddenly began screaming in pain and shaking his legs. Ivan stood nearby and called for his brother in a panic. Ivan conjured and magic symbols appeared in front of him, and he made them call Will bad names, but Will warned that using magic now would also hurt Danan. Will squeezed Danan's hand and Danan screamed. Ivan said Will was just afraid of him. Will asked Ivan what made him think Will was afraid. Danan lay on the ground with tears streaming down his face. Sure, Will had grabbed him so hard he couldn't move, while Will still held him by the neck and said Danan wasn't as confident as he used to be. Will rode Danan and held him, saying Will could easily defeat Danan but liked to torture him. Danan cried for mercy. Ivan stood nearby and said Will needed to stop because they were giving up. The man waved his head. Will closed his eyes for a moment, then released Danon, who lay motionless in the arena, groaning softly. Will looked at him and said there was no point in continuing the fight with Danan. Danon lay in the arena, shaking his arms and legs and crying and screaming, while Will stood beside him and said he would give the others time to recover, then they could try to attack again, but only honestly. The Vormis family's men were already nearby, making exaggerated gestures to activate magic. We watched and knew he had to end the fight quickly, or he might not make it to the exam. The Vormis family men started talking, ready to attack Will again. Will watched them and knew this fight had to end immediately. The Vormis children began moving their hands and casting spells, and the onlookers felt the magic Dean and Ivan were conjuring as the mood began to unsettle everyone. A dark mood fell over Anne and Ivan as many conjured insects appeared. Will stood and watched a dark cloud move toward him. He thought the men had used black magic. The crowd in the stands did not understand what was happening. The men made new hand gestures and asked Will if he was ready to resume the fight. He saw their magic was strong and knew he had to attack immediately. Will stepped aside, determined he would find a way to defeat them. Later, the guys began using black magic and people might ask them about it. Will had a glowing magic ball appear in his hand and told the guys they were no problem for him. Danon clenched his fist, smiled maliciously, and asked if Will could do anything at all with his weakest magic. Will swung and hurled the magic bunk into the dark cloud the men had conjured with black magic earlier. Will held up his hand and asked for a little more time, then cast a spell that sent a bright flash of magic through the arena, and he looked up, smiled, and explained that the ability absorbed insects and incinerated them. Danon and Ivan saw Will's magic and were angry and surprised that a single move could destroy magic. The Vorma family started using magic. A whirlwind spun from Danon's hand and I conjured sharp stones that moved toward Will, who stood thinking the earth and wind powers they'd activated were very strong. Will jumped and dodged the man's magical attacks, and Danon and Ivan grew nervous since none of their attacks hit him, so they began planning how to defeat him. Let's start by noting he had some questions about the guy's magic gods. What made those gods choose them? That I have an oath to the god of insects and earth, and that Danon is the god of wind and earth. The men watched the duel and agreed Will was handling two opponents better, and the fight would end soon, since the fighters had almost no magic left to continue. Looking at mine, the man decided the battle's outcome was already certain. A girl came up to him and asked if the man could tell him how Will's fight was going. Ari stood in front of the man and adjusted her scarf. The man recognized her. Will jumped up and dodged, and the man stretched out his arm and threw magic punches. He said Ari was asking why, because she could already see everything herself. Will's whole body glowed with magic as he focused on the battle, and the man told Ari that Will had used a magical attack to boost the flow of magic in his body, something a skilled child could do. The man remembered Will's first capture on Danin, and said Will had maneuvered, dodged an attack, and knocked his opponent down. A move like that takes years of practice, and Will did it with amazing ease. Opening one eye, the man in the hat said the strength of his will would let him easily defeat both a human and a large beast. Ari looked at him and listened in silence. Ari remembered how Will saved Saria, saying he reacted instantly during the rescue and wasn't even hurt, and the man realized Ari had seen Will's improved skills even without his stories. Ari turned away and said she needed to leave for a while. The man looked at her and said she was not interested in staying to see how the fight ended and who would win. The winded children of the Vormis family could not catch their breath and were completely exhausted. Will stood before them as if nothing had happened and realized the fight was already over. Looking at Danon, we said their guardians were exhausted and would not fight anymore. Danon grew angry when Will spoke. Will began to use magic. His hand glowed and clumps of magical energy rose above it as he said, now was the right time to end the fight. Will spread his arms out, and two large spheres of magic appeared above them, making the Vormis family frown in surprise as they asked Will what sorcery he used and how he combined fire and water. Will sent two bursts of magic at the Vormis men, who were caught off guard, and the magic clots struck them in the head, so they held their breath as the attack turned into a water trap for the Vormis family. They kept the boys in a water trap and warned that if they did not admit defeat, they could suffocate. Will raised his hand, and magic flowed from his index finger as he sighed, saying the guys had 4 guardian deities in their arsenal, but even with them they could not defeat him and needed to train harder. We looked away, alarmed. I could not see where the guys were standing. They began drinking the water around their heads. Will made a strange face when he saw the boys' full bellies. The men who had drunk all the water began saying they could not be beaten so easily. He had to brace for defeat. Will closed his eyes and said the man should not expect him to give up, and that the fight was worth finishing. The Vormis family looked at Willen in surprise, not understanding what he meant. Will closed his eyes and began to conjure, and the water and the children's bellies gurgled as Danan clutched his bulging stomach. Will stood with his arm outstretched. The Vormis men clutched their stomachs and told him to wait. They had to use the bathroom or they'd burst. Will said of course they needed to go because they had drunk so much water. Will stood before the men clutching their stomachs and warned them to admit defeat and go to the bathroom before it was too late, as beads of sweat formed on Danan's face, but the men still refused to give in. Danan shouted at Will that Will could kill them because they refused to admit defeat. Will was stunned to hear such a response from the guys. We got nervous and said the guys didn't seem to be in their right mind if they didn't admit defeat. They would go to the bathroom in front of everyone. The Vormis men were unbearably tense, their teeth clenched as tight as possible. A moment later, a roll of toilet paper began to unwind. Tears and saliva began to flow from the eyes and mouths of the warmest children in the family. Their faces were already relaxed, and small insects began to fly around them. Spectators around the arena were shocked by what was happening, saying the men had completely disgraced themselves and looked pathetic. The men knelt with flies buzzing around them as onlookers watched the fight and began taunting the Vormis children. Will stared at Tanan's tear-stained face and thought he'd probably gone too far for humiliating the guys in front of everyone, but he still felt he was right, because they had insisted on the fight. Will grabbed the boys by their shirts as tears streamed down their faces, pulled them close, and angrily warned that no boy should ever approach his sister again, their teeth chattering with fear. Will kept the guys at arm's length and shouted that their fight was over. An unpleasant smell came from them. Holding the men by their shirts, Will felt it was a little cruel when he used magic to make a terrifying voice. They deserved it. Their faces were streaked with tears and flies buzzed around them. Will raised his head and wondered if the boys' deities were fit to be their guardians. Will grabbed Ivan's shirt and his hand began to glow with magic. Tears streamed down Ivan's face. Afterward, he let the others go, lowered his head and stared at his glowing hands. He had no idea why it was happening. Leaning on the arena, the man in the hat asked Will if he was okay. Will turned and said everything was fine. Then the man climbed into the arena and said now was the time to end it. Standing beside Will, the man raised his hand and loudly announced that Will had won the fight, and the spectators began to cheer his victory. Will told the man he was sorry the fight had led to this, and offered to stay and help clean up. And the man tried to answer, but someone cut him off and said Will should not worry about the consequences. Two people stood beside Artie in mourning clothes with scarves bearing patches of a coat of arms tied around their necks. One of them said Will had to go with them, and a faint aura came from the strangers. One of the strangers watched the man in the hat with Will standing beside him, and the stranger said the exam would not be cancelled, so they would have to handle it and take control of the process, which the man agreed to. The Vormis children stood motionless, unable to collect themselves. Flies buzzed around them. Will suggested he could help clean up the arena before the exam started. Artie replied that Will should not worry about it. A stone gallum stood beside her, already turned to the side. She said it would automatically clean the whole room when switched on. Will was delighted by the gallum in front of him holding a broom. The hooded strangers said it was time for them and Will to leave. Will turned and agreed to go with them. He turned when someone called his name and saw Artie with her face flushed, and she adjusted her scarf with one hand and thanked Will for his kindness. Will walked among strangers in raincoats, turned with a smile, told Artie not to thank him because the guys had dirtied the arena because of him and apologized for not being able to prevent it. Will raised his hand and called Rin and Fury over, inviting them to come with him. They ran to him and fell in behind him. Will, Rin, and Fury followed the two cloaked strangers down the hallway, which had large windows that let sunlight into the room. Will looked at the strangers' glowing auras and decided they were hiding their magic. But something still felt wrong and they were probably blocking their power so he could not sense it. He will continue to stare ahead, expressionless, thinking that if the strangers were part of an organization, It meant Artie was their student, and they planned to destroy the monster behind the disaster. Magic opens a door before Will, and he steps into a room with large windows partly covered by curtains that, like the stranger's scarves, display a coat of arms. Will scanned the room as swords on the wall caught the sunlight, and he grew alert, recognizing them and knowing exactly who owned them. One stranger jumped on Will from behind, and with his hood down, his face was visible. He cried with happiness and said it had been too long since they had seen the master, and Will did not understand. Nearby stood the second stranger, his hood still on and looking confused. The man who jumped on Will said Will had become so cute, and Will asked to be left alone. Holding Will by the neck, the stranger said she had long wanted to meet her teacher. Will remembered the swords on the wall and thought Zenobia had used them. The stranger was Zenobia. Zenobia kept holding Will by the neck while crying hard. Will forced himself to stay calm, convinced it was her and that she knew who he had been in a past life. The girl kept hugging Will, and he said he thought she was Zenobia. She said happily that Will was right. Beside them stood another man in a robe whose face was hidden under a dark hood. He will close his eyes and ask her why she ran up and hugged a stranger from behind. She staggered, shocked by the question. They turned to her and said that, but they hadn't even seen each other's faces. He wondered who she wanted to see. Zenobia blushed deeply and could not speak. A moment later, tears ran down her flushed face from embarrassment, her speech growing indistinct as she immediately felt Will's concern as her teacher, and Will tensed and asked Zenobia to gather her strength and stop crying. The second stranger pulls back his hood and says he will explain everything now, so Will turns toward the voice in surprise, sees the man's face and recognizes him. Milt, the second stranger, had blonde hair tied back in a ponytail and wore glasses, and he said it had been a long time since they last met. Will looked at Milton in surprise, feeling Milton's magic the moment Milton pulled back his hood, a magic that could belong to no one else. Milton said 4 of Will's students serve as the Academy's presidents. Milt closed his eyes, pulled out a bundle of papers, and said he immediately recognized the master by using that bundle. Milt unfolded the paper, revealing many inscriptions and a coat of arms in the center. He said it was a magic package attached to the questionnaire to measure the subject's magical power in advance. Will rubbed his chin, remembering how he'd filled out this form before, sitting at a table covered with papers and holding a bundle in his hands. So Nobian Milk was holding the package. She said the package had been sent to them immediately so they could confirm whether it belonged to the master. Milk said he had at first thought a child had been born who had taken on a mother's qualities. Zenobia raised her hand in front of her and said that once they found out, they decided to watch Will. Zenobia and Milk specifically sent Artie to stay with Will to look after him and go everywhere with him. Will looked at Zenobia and said that Artia had turned out well, praising Zenobia. Zenobia replied that it was her duty to raise a worthy student, just as her master had raised her before. Will looked at Milt and said that if he had been a child who inherited a master's qualities, he would have followed his teacher, and he had no doubt that Milt had been a very good teacher. Milk cupped his chin and said thoughtfully that he had heard the guardian deities watched over the pillar, that the gods loved those guys and stayed close to them, and we looked at MIT in surprise and thought he had not changed a bit. Milton had hastily checked the measurement barrier's log and found the child was the master's reincarnation and clearly an apostle. Will looked surprised and did not know what apostle meant. Will remembered what the goddess had said before when she raised her hand and said she hoped he would behave because he was an apostle and should never forget that. Milt remembered Mater's old appearance. In a recent duel, he noticed something when Mater showed him a spell that caused diarrhea in an enemy, and Will said Mater had probably used that terrible spell in a past life. Milt held out his hand and said the spell had shown him Will was the master's reincarnation. Will said that was a good reason to get to know Milt. Milt grew nervous and said he thought they might not notice it. Will stared at Milt without saying a word. Will smiled with malice and said he had many more stories from his past life that would definitely let them recognize him. Zenobia appeared behind him and eagerly asked him to tell those stories. Zenobia drooped when she heard Will's story. Will said that when she was about 5, she had asked him to shave half her head. Zenobia blushed and said that could happen. Zenobia took Will by the shoulders and said nervously that more than 200 years had passed, and it was time for new stories, wondering what Will had been doing while he was in heaven. Melt listened to the conversation between Zenobia and Will and understood none of it. Will said the goddess had told him about the situation, though he was only about 10 years old. Zenobia told him to tell her everything he knew himself. After a few hours at the slot, Will said he understood the Tenebrous cult, and Milt, sitting across from me, said he and the others were a rescue slot created to fight it. Milk said that knowing the Beast of Calamity had died, their first priority was to stop it from coming back, and that even the rescue squad could not stop the cult from resurrecting it. Milt put his hands on his feet, bent down, and said that most fanatics are ordinary people, but at the center of all events a demon controls them. Will sat in silence and listened to Milt's story. Will introduced a huge horned demon and thought demons were extremely powerful and nearly impossible to subdue. Imagine a laughing demon, and believe that even the students who would later become strong warriors could not defeat it because of its unimaginable power. Milk adjusted his glasses and said some information had not been confirmed before the monster died. Will, surprised, asked what the information was. Milk told them that more powerful demons had appeared, but they were defeated with help from 4 students. Will was surprised by what he heard. Milk recalled images of 2 girls, a young man, and a dragon. Milt, sitting across from Will, said these demons were once fanatics like the disaster beast, but their power grew until they became uncontrollable. Will asked whether a human could be turned into a demon. Will sighed and said he had trained to fight demons, but now it seemed impossible for him. Milt said they were glad to have found Will and sat down beside him and listened. Milk told Will they were eager to hear his stories, especially about the education he received in heaven, and Will said he was surprised by Milk's interest since he had been away and had just returned after 100 years. Milk smiled and said time was passing too fast, and he was no longer that young man. Then Will shrugged a little and said that even though Milk was 120, he looked no older than 60. Milt told Will that Will's appearance comes from inner energy, so he looks younger than his age. Milt's eyes filled with tears. Artie looked at Milth and cheerfully said, Milth had been holding back his feelings all this time. Milth took off his glasses and said Artie was right, and he thought he would never meet the master again. Artie said cheerfully that in the future she thought it would be nice for Will to enroll at the academy, but he would have to hide his past. Will raised his hand and replied that he needed to take the entrance exams first. Remembering the man in the little hat, she said Will had shown excellent skill in the fight. The examiner who ran the fight admitted Will to the academy without exams, and Will was surprised by the result. Milk picked up the cup, brought it to his mouth, then said he needed to let Dion and Regina know that Will was here. Will, surprised, asked how the boys would be told. Melt raised his hand and a ring glinted on one finger. He explained it was a summoning ring he had made himself and that he would give it to Will later. Will was surprised because he did not know how it had been made. Will looked at Milt and said Milt's talent for creating unusual things was exceptional. Taking off his glasses, Milt wiped his eyes, clearly moved by Will's praise. He activated the ring and explained how to use it properly. Milt began speaking in conjured round symbols with inscriptions and asked the others if they could hear him. They replied that they could. Dion stood on a broken pillar surrounded by ruins and wounded people. Regina held a weapon with wounded enemies behind her. They spoke to Milk and wondered why it had called them. Milt told the others to listen carefully because the news was important, and the Master had been reborn and appeared with 2 divine beings, stunning Dion and Regina. They asked if the Master was about to melt, and if so, they wanted to hear his voice. Will approached the magicians to speak with them. He said he was glad to hear them, and that it had not been 100 years since they last spoke. Dione and Regina replied that it had been a long time since they last saw the Master. Will blushed and said he looked forward to meeting them and would then tell them everything in detail. Some background noise came through during the conversation, and the guys said they were also glad to hear from the Master. Will closed his eyes, smiled, and said goodbye to the guys, and they said goodbye in return. Milt said time was up and the connection was cut off. Will said with satisfaction that even after 100 years the guys hadn't changed at all. Milk was still very sentimental and felt embarrassed by Will's words, while Zenobia sat beside her. Zenobia jerked and blushed when a knock sounded at the door. It was Artie, and she let him in while all the guys stood up and waited for him to enter the room. Artie entered the room and said she had returned from her assignment. Zenobia replied that Will would continue studying at the academy and that Artie would keep looking after him and should always stay by his side. Artie blushed. Zenobia pulled her hand aside and said Will would be a student and wanted to join the rescue squad, so Artie should watch him to make sure he did not embarrass them. Artie was surprised that Will could get into the academy so easily. Zenobia laid a hand on Artie's shoulder and said she trusted Artie's abilities and was counting on her to help Will. Artie agreed dutifully. Artie paused, blushed, and said she had a suggestion she wanted to discuss with Zenobia, who was ready to listen. Artie stood in Zenobia, France. Her cheeks flushed as she asked if she could study at the academy with Will. Zenobia looked at her in surprise. Milt and Will stood behind Artie. She said she had previously served as an assistant during the exam. Wanting to become a student after being seen as an assistant was not unusual. She spread her arms wide and asked Zenobia what she thought of her proposal. Zenobia thought for a moment. Zenobia went up to Artie and patted her on the head, then said she had a great idea. Artie blushed and thanked Zenobia for her kind words. Zenobia asked Will if he agreed to Artie's proposal. Will smiled and agreed, thinking that if it was meant to keep his identity secret, he did not oppose it. Will approached Artie, took her hands, smiled, and said he was very happy to continue their cooperation. Artie smiled and agreed. Zenobia stood in front of Artie and said she had no news that Zenobia needed to know. Artie replied she had a report that the exam passed without problems and 30 people were selected. Melted Artie heard about it. Zenobia raised her hand and asked whether anyone had been seriously injured during the exam. I had already thought about it. Then she remembered the injured faces of the boys from the Worms family and said that Dan and Ivan had been seriously injured. Will stood in front of Artie and asked why the men had been so badly injured after the fight with him. Artie raised her hands and said Will should not worry because they were hurt after the fight ended. He recalled the men holding a jar of insects and said that after the fight with Will, they went to find him to get revenge, found poisonous insects and tried to use them on Will but could not control them, and the insects escaped and bit them. Artie remembered the men lying in bed with bandages and said they were back in the hospital after the insect incident because they were badly hurt. The referee during Will's battle with the Worms family boys told them he was not jealous of their divine guardians. Artie said the boys might still not calm down and would keep harassing Will. Artie had already said the men from the Worms families were at Pillar 0, which surprised Zenobia, Will, and Milt and sent Zenobia and Milt into a panic. Zenobia and Milt looked at each other, and he asked whether the human race could interfere with the apostles, and Milt covered his mouth and said he thought the chance of successfully establishing contact between the boys and the apostles was 0. Artie hung back, not sure what was happening. Zenobia, Milt, and Will whispered away from him. Wondering if the boys could reach the apostles, Will remembered standing at the post with the ball earlier. It happened in the world of the gods, where tall columns held up a ceiling painted with magical symbols. A goddess stood before Will, stroking his head and asking why he was using that portal again. The goddess moved away from Will and asked what had brought him to them, wondering if he wanted to ask about those close relatives or had been spying on her all this time, and she blushed as she paused to think. The goddess turned, her cheeks flushed, and she said it was all an accident. Will slumped and looked unhappy with her answer. Raising her hand, the goddess asked whether Will knew why he had not received the blessing, and he was angry and surprised when she said he had removed it himself. The goddess remembered their earlier conversation and said Will himself had admitted he did not deserve to touch the gods. Will thought about it and replied that he might have said that, but he could not remember any reason for saying it. The goddess said Will was an apostle, a messenger of God. Will asked whether the apostle might have any power. The goddess remembered their last meeting and said that if the other gods had not stopped her, she would have told them about it sooner. The goddess and Will sat on a small hill while other deities walked behind them, and Will asked what the apostles looked like. She said she would explain everything the next time he visited her. Will looked at the goddess menacingly and said everything about him was clear, but he could not understand why the worms family had as many as 4 deities, and the goddess tensed slightly, thinking Will had not changed at all. The goddess recalled the images of various gods and said, "They do not choose people by any rule. They only help when it is necessary." She smiled and added that sadly, they are not omnipotent either. Will and the goddess kept sitting. The goddess said the paradox was that even the most unfortunate people are protected by gods. Will agreed. Will began to flicker and slowly fade. Legata said it was time for him to return to his world and that he should not visit her often. Will was surprised by her words. The goddess smiled and warned him that if he looked at her too often, his mind would become confused and he could die. Will replied that it could be a problem. The goddess said a few more words before he returned to his world, promising to find a way to contact him to keep his presence in her world minimal because he was not yet a god. Will returned to Milton. He and Zenobia stood in an odd room beside the pillar used to communicate with the guardians. Zenobia said Will was very strong. Will said it was too long to explain and that it was because of reincarnation. We spoke with Milt, and he said the time flow between the worlds was different, so they could not stay there long, but because of that he was able to practice. Will, Zenobia, and Milt sat at the table with Fury and Rune beside them. Will was told about his plans for the future. Then Will said goodbye to everyone and returned to Syria. A few days later, Will sat on a bench outside as Syria ran around playing with the animals. Sitting on the bench, Will remembered Milt saying the result would be announced in a week and the ceremony would be held the same day, so he should be ready, yet he could not understand why he felt no worry. Surya lifted Rune into her arms and told Will to look at them. Fury stood right beside her. Will glanced at Surya and said she shouldn't go too far. Sitting on the bench, Will thought he could spend a little time alone and not worry about anything. Someone was walking toward him. Will turned away when he heard people talking. A girl walked toward him wearing a large dark hat, a dark suit, and gloves. She looked at him and said she needed him. Soldiers stood behind her. Taking Will's hand, the girl said she was very grateful that he had saved her in the forest. Will blushed and said there was no need to thank him. It was simply what needed to be done. Will looked at the girl and introduced himself to her. She clasped her hands in front of her and said he was from that famous Worms family. A soldier stood behind the girl and put his hand to his mouth to cough. The girl tensed up. Picking up the dress, the girl apologized for not introducing herself and said she was Tina Dia Irmadi, the 3rd princess of the Irmadi family, then looked at Will and said it was important to get to know him. Will studied the map of nearby kingdoms and decided that Baradoa bordered the northeast and belonged to the empire of Irmadi. He had long enjoyed good relations with that empire. Tina smiled and raised a finger in front of her and explained, "The teacher always gives students a middle name, so she got Dia." And Will looked at her and said she deserved praise at that age. Tina clasped her hands and said the 3rd princess was very unlikely to inherit the throne, so she was glad to attend this academy on Lord Dion's recommendation and planned to get the best education here. Surya walked up to Will and called to him, and he looked back at her. A fury sat on Surya's head, and Rin stood beside her. Will introduced Tina to Surya. The girls greeted each other. Will smiled at Surya and said Tina was their friend now, so Surya should be nicer to her. Surya reached out to Tina and agreed with Will. Tina blushed, surprised by Will's words. Tina looked at Will and said he had said they were friends now, and because she had no friends at school, she felt so happy that she covered her face with her hat and began to shake. Tina suddenly took Will's hands and said she would not cause any trouble. She was happy to make friends with the guys. The soldier behind Tina said it was time for her to leave. She turned to him and told Will she was sorry, but had to go. Will said everything was fine and they would see each other again. She moved to the side where the soldiers stood. Will stood with Surya, Fury, and Rin at his side as half the soldiers stood before him, placed their hands on their chests, and bowed, surprising him. Soldiers straightened and headed after the fleeing Tina as she looked back at Will and the others and waved. Will recognized some of the soldiers' faces and for a moment thought he had fought with them before. Surprised, Surya asked if he was okay. He said everything was fine. Will stroked Surya's head and smiled, saying they could keep playing. Surya was happy with the suggestion. Someone was hiding behind a nearby tree. It was a girl with ear tattoos who recognized Will. Will sat across from Artie holding a gun. Trees lined the street where the boys stood with leaves falling. Sari lay on a bench with Fury under her head, and both were alert and ready to start the battle. Will and Artie held fighting poses for a while and stared at each other. Saria slept on the bench with Fury, snoring softly, then began to toss and turn while lying on Fury, clearly bothered by something, while Fury remained asleep. Will stared at Artie with a serious expression, and she returned the same look. Then Artie raised her sword overhead and attacked him first, screaming as she struck. Her blade aimed straight at Will while he stayed intensely focused and serious. Will Grabs had already soared with both hands. She hovered in the air with the sword and was very surprised by this outcome. Will held the sword with both hands, and they were shaking a little. Artie warned Will not to lower her sword, so Will pushed the blade. Artie held aside and moved close to her and touched her shoulder. Will grabs Artie by the shoulders and throws her over him. She opens her mouth in shock as she flies. Artie lands on her feet and puts one hand on the floor to keep her balance. Artie has no time to come to her senses when her own sword appears in front of her with its tip aimed at her face, and she is surprised. Will holds Artie's sword, and from her knees she says she is ready to give up, the sword glittering in the sun. Will hands the sword to Artie. After the fight, Artie says she now understands why her teacher calls Will the master. Will replies that Artie is also skilled with a sword. Will stands in front of Artie and says he can now say they really had a full workout. Saria woke up and began yawning loudly, covering her wide-open mouth. Saria rubbed one eye with one hand, stroked Fury, who was yawning, with the other, and told Will she was already awake. Saria looked at the guys in surprise and told Artie that they had been playing without her again, and she missed everything. Artie and Will looked at Saria's red face. Will put a hand on his belt and told Artie that it was time for her to leave. Artie looked at Saria and agreed it was time for her to go. Saria grew upset when Artie said that. Saria grabbed Artie's sleeve in tears and asked if Artie could stay a little longer and play with her. Artie blushed and said she could stay, but only for a short time. A week passed as the wind stirred the treetops. Many people came to the booth to check their entrance exam results. Will stood at the back of the crowd with Surya, Fury, and Ren by his side. He already thought he knew his results but pretended to watch so the other students would not suspect him. Saria raised her hands and asked Will if his name was on that stand. Will blushed, embarrassed that his name would stay there for a long time. Will looked at the stand and noticed Ivan and Dan's names were not on it. Someone greeted him, and he realized he was being addressed and turned around. A girl with animal-like ears appeared before Will, holding a girl who looked like her in one hand, raising the other and saying her name was Rosetta, and that the girl with her was her sister Rosa, who was peeking out from behind Rosetta. Rosa threw herself into Saria's arms, and they hugged. Will stood beside her, stunned, and unable to understand how the girls knew each other. Rosa and Saria held hands and smiled. Saria said they had played with Rose before, but Rose would not remember that moment. Will replied that he understood everything, and that he had met the girls that day. Will stood in front of Rosetta and thanked her for taking care of her sister. Rosetta closed her eyes in embarrassment and said she was happy to meet and make new friends. Rosetta raised her hands, blushed, and said she had passed the entrance exam and would start at the academy this year. Will smiled and said that was good news. Winking, he said he knew she had been following him yesterday. Rosetta was disheveled and blushed at Will's words. She was surprised Will had figured her out. Will said he did not feel threatened, so he did not worry. Rosetta scratched her head nervously and said she had been a little worried when she heard him talking to the princess. She apologized for her behavior, and he replied she didn't need to apologize because he would have done the same in her place. Will held out his hand to Rosetta and said that since their sisters were friends, he hoped that he and Rosetta would get along too. Rosetta agreed, and they shook hands cheerfully. Saria and Rosa took turns embarrassing Will and Rosetta. Will smiled and looked toward the girls, and Rosetta gave in to their teasing, blushing as she asked them not to embarrass her. Fury and Rin continued on. The day of the dedication ceremony arrived. Guests filed into a large building with columns. Attendees sat in a big hall listening to the leaders. Princess Tina, the third princess, also spoke and read from a book. I attended a briefing for freshmen in the classroom. The teacher wrote and drew symbols on the blackboard. Students sat at their desks and listened attentively. At a general meeting, Will and the others met and got to know each other over drinks, with Will holding Saria in his arms, Tina standing beside him, and Artie stroking Saria's head. Lunch break arrived. A carved plaque shaped like a loaf of bread and ears of wheat marked the room's entrance. Will and the others sat at the table with the animals and ate while Rosetta held a glass and said her village had been attacked by a demon, so she wanted to help catch it but needed help, and Will sat across from her and listened. Rosetta flattened her ears and shed a tear, then said, her guardian is the god of hunting, so she is not skilled in martial arts and her deity offers no help in combat. Will looked at Rosetta and said he was ready to join her in the search for the monster because he couldn't leave a friend alone, and Rosetta clenched her fists and thanked Will happily. Rose fed Saria a spoonful of food while watching the girls. Will said that if they were going to search for a demon, they needed to assemble a team that could use both magic and weapons. After a while, Tina appears before Will, holding a magic staff and already wearing a sword and scabbard on her belt. Will stood in front of Tina with Rosetta at his side and said Rosetta had probably already met the girls who were with Tina. They were excellent swordsmen and magicians. Tina said nervously that Will was praising her too much. Will watched Tina, Rosetta, and Artie and thought they would make a good team consisting of a swordsman, a hunter, a magician, and a healer. Artie cupped her hand to her mouth so only Will could hear and said Zenobia had given them permission to leave the academy walls safely. Will thanked her. Rosetta wiggled her ears and offered to go. Rosetta and Tina jumped up cheerfully, saying they needed to get rid of the demon as soon as possible. Will stood behind her with his hands on his hips, smiling. Artie stood behind me with no expression. Birds flew up from the crowns of the lush trees. The wolf's body split in two. Then a hooded stranger appeared holding a skeleton spine topped by a skull. The demon had already climbed higher while searching for a Will and his team. A stranger's face appeared from beneath the hood. Instead of a face, there was a skull with sharp teeth. The boys walked through the forest near the palace. Will walked in front, someone walked behind, and Rosetta and Tina walked between them. Tina walked and sang a song. Tina held her magic staff, smiling and singing. Will stepped in front of her and smiled. Tina blushed and said he looked very happy. Tina walked behind Will, stuck out her tongue, and looked like she was walking with friends. Will smiled as he walked and said he understood and felt as happy as she did. The men walked past a sprawling tree while Tina followed Will and said she could heal any wound if anything happened to them since she was a good healer, and Will turned to say they were counting on her. Will asked if Tina could heal wounds and if her guardian was the god of water. Tina smiled and said Will was right. Tina held up 2 fingers and said she still had several guardians, the gods of thunder, air, fire, and ice. Will looked at her in surprise and said she had 8 pillars, including the human god. Tina nervously waved her hands and said people like Will only needed one guardian deity. Will left and asked Tina to stop flattering him. Will stood before Rosetta, spread his arms, and announced she would have a guardian, the god of hunting. Rosetta looked at him and agreed. Rosetta carried a bow on her back, glanced to the side, and said she was skilled with it and could read any creature's tracks, so they would find the demon quickly. A bird flew over the treetops. Trees and shrubs surrounded the children. Rosetta stretched out her hand, pointed to the side, and said, "You can see the village from here." Will and Tina walked up to Rosetta and looked into the distance. Rosetta said the villagers make money hunting and selling sheep, and she thought this was a great place to live. Will smiled and agreed. From a small hill, the boys could see the whole village, with houses and crop plots. The villagers resembled Rosetta. They had ears and tattoos on their arms. One person planted herbs, another worked on construction. Rosetta walked toward them, raised her hand, and greeted the villagers cheerfully. The man with a tattoo on his face and the woman beside him recognized her. Rosetta stepped closer to the villagers. A resident said she had returned too soon and must have failed the exam. Rosetta waved her hand, said she had passed every test, and entered the academy. Rosetta scratched her head in embarrassment. The villagers praised and congratulated her. Upon entering the academy, they considered her the pride of their village. Will and the girls stood behind, thinking they were in Rosetta's native village. Rosetta pointed at the guys and said she would like to introduce the villagers to her friends. Rosetta introduced Will, Arditha the swordsman, and Tina the healer to the villagers, and the men were pleased to meet Rosetta's fellow villagers, bowing politely to greet them. An elderly villager approached Will and shook his hand, saying he was pleased to meet Rosetta's friends, and Will smiled while returning the handshake. Rosetta spread her arms to the side and told the villagers they had come to destroy the demon, and they began to rejoice. An elderly man approached Tina and thanked the adventurers, explaining they had contacted the guild for help and were grateful they had come, and Tina raised her hands and said she was glad and that she was Rosetta's friend. Will turns to an elderly man and asks if the man can tell him more about the demon that attacked their village. The man agrees to tell him about the demon. The man remembered the first meeting with the demon, when a villager said it appeared in the pastures while he grazed sheep with his dog and did not notice. Recalling more, he said that when he saw the demon, he ran in fear to the village, tried to call the sheep after him, but the demon dragged many away, took their crops and ruined the harvest. After hearing the demon story, the boys left the village and went back to the place where they first saw it. Will studied the tree while Rosetta examined the footprints. She found something and called the others to come see. Rosetta placed her hand beside a large footprint on the ground and said it looked like a demon bear's print, which surprised the guys because of its size. Rosetta squatted and looked toward the bushes, saying the trail went that way. They decided the demon could have returned to his lair, but they needed to follow the tracks. Gradually, the sky darkened. A little later, the heroes reach a small clearing and see a dark cave. One of them says they think they've found her, and adds that the tracks end at the cave. The boys stayed huddled in the bushes by the cave. Rosetta said their target appeared to be inside, then looked at Tina and asked what she was doing. Tina stood stunned with her mouth open, making a long sound as if about to speak. The girl then turned to her team and asked if they thought they could use magic. Tina did not understand and asked what she meant. Will smiled and said Tina's strategy also had its place. Tina awkwardly scratched her head and smiled. Rosetta said when the demon comes out of the cave, they will leave it with her bow and Tina's magic. Tina smiled and told the team to leave it to her. Rosetta said Artie would then attack the demon with a sword. Artie agreed and said she understood. Rosetta said Will would be there in case something went wrong. Will agreed. The group gathered and Rosetta asked if everyone was ready. She began the countdown. When the operation began, Tina lifted a finger, channeled magic, and summoned a glowing orb above her head. The girl launched a huge fireball toward the demon's cave, then awkwardly said she'd overdone it and needed to shrink the ball or a big fire would start. A very loud roar filled the air and startled the girls. A moment later, a huge bear leaped out at them. Tina recoiled at the sight of the monster as the bear growled and moved closer. A huge monster froze Tina and Rosetta in horror. Rosetta opened her eyes and said it was enormous. Tina squeezed her eyes shut and screamed. At the next moment, the girls drew their swords and a slashing blow rang out. Artie slipped in behind the monster, her sword flashing as the demon bear froze in its menacing stance. Artie sheathed her sword with a soft sound and said everything was ready as the demon bear crashed down, and Tina, sounding indignant, apologized to the others, saying she had been so scared she was confused when she saw how huge the monster was. Tina then told Artie that she looked so cool holding the sword confidently and praised Artie as great. And Rosetta added that even with good eyesight and focus she did not notice him, and Artie dealt with him in no time. He thought that was to be expected from his student. Then Artie looked at the carcass of the demon bear lying nearby and said the bear was truly huge, and Rosetta was surprised by Artie's words. Approaching the demon bear, she spread her arms. Agreeing with Artie, she said the girl was right. The fur looks thick, but is actually very thin. Will suddenly distracted the girls. Telling Rosetta to stop, he touched his chin thoughtfully and wondered whether the demon bear ate many sheep. Rosetta said that was very strange, and she would go look into the cave. Will told Artie they'd go look around while Artie and Tina butchered the bear. Rosetta offered her very sharp knife for them to use. Artie said she understood and picked up the sharp knife. Will and Rosetta emerged from the cave after a while. Will apologized to Tina and said they'd been in the cave a long time. He looked closer and said it was very strange. There were no bones, no fur, and no other traces in the cave. A different demon might have eaten the sheep. He had already watched and thought about the huge claw. Rosetta looked at the bear carcass and said that in that case they would have to find another demon before it ate someone else. Will approached the carcass and said the girls had done a great job. Artie asked what they would do with it. Will gave a wink and offered to take this bear to Rosetta's village, and the girl was very surprised and cried out. Will looked at the girls and said he thought the bear carcass would be excellent compensation for the damage. He asked the girls what they thought. Tina said she agreed with Will and called him a friend. Another girl said she did not mind either. Will looked at Rosetta and checked if she was all right. And she, surprised, smiled through tears and thanked the guys for everything. Will suggested the girls collect everything and take it to the village so the residents can decide. He noticed the fur was large and heavy. Rosetta added they should keep only the fur because the demon may have poisoned the meat, so the meat must be discarded. Tina suggested making a real fire instead of using magic and said you could hold the meat in the flames, and Will suddenly stared at the furious creature that had jumped out. The next moment, Fury jumped out of Will's body and ran to the side. Will reached out toward Fury, shouted after him, and realized he couldn't hold him. Fury leapt into the butchered demon bear's body. Immediately it swelled and began devouring the carcass, while a group of guys watched in shock. Fury's power surprised Will, and he could not understand what was happening. Rosetta and Artie kept watching. At that moment, the pieces of the demon bear's body began to dissolve into Fury's body, and Will and Rosetta watched in amazement. Surprised, Rosetta watched the pieces of meat dissolve into Fury's body and said they were disappearing before her eyes. Rosetta and Tina watched the smaller Fury. Rosetta said it was incredible that only fur and fangs remained. Then Fury released something from himself, and Tina realized it was the processed remains of its food. Standing awkwardly beside the dark mass, Fury listened as Rosetta said, "It looked like hummus," and Tina said it was amazing that something like that could form in Fury's body. Tina hugged Fury and said that, as she had thought, Fury was simply a wonderful slime. Rosetta turned to Tina and Fury and began shouting angrily, opening her mouth. Rosetta looked at Will and shouted that the slime could just digest the bear demon like that. She didn't believe it and thought Fury was a new species. Will scratched his cheek and admitted he didn't know much about Fury's abilities. Will told Rosetta they had to go and search the pasture and the area around it again, so they would not miss a single clue, and Rosetta agreed to go with him. After a while, the group arrived at the pasture. This was the right place because the fence near the forest was broken. They looked toward the broken fence and said the demon bear came from there. Rosetta sat by the trail, pointed out the nearby sheep tracks and matching demon tracks, then stood and said they all came from the other side and invited the team to look around. Soon the team reached a deep forest, and Rosetta spotted something and told the others it looked interesting. She suddenly spotted wolf tracks and asked whether they were demons too, and Will said the sheep had been stolen by wolves, not by a demon bear, while Rosetta said that if the wolves were a pack, they had joined forces with the bear to steal the sheep. Rosetta put her hand to her mouth and said the tracks were fresh, so they were heading somewhere and hunting sheep would be easy. She told the boys to look. The tracks matched. The sheep were following together, and she wondered if this could happen without a shepherd. Rosetta then saw something amazing and pointed out the 11 tracks. Will was surprised, said it was impossible, and asked if the girl had miscalculated or had suddenly made a mistake. Rosetta said her calculations were correct and suggested the teen follow the tracks further since they ran into this cave. Rosetta said there were no wolves and that the sheep had come here and hidden from the demons on their own. We will check whether that was possible. She added that the others might not believe it, but the sheep could not have come here by themselves. Tina said she believed Rosetta. Artie said she believed Rosetta too. Rosetta smiled awkwardly and thanked Artie and Tina. Approaching the cave, the girl said she would look around, then glanced to the side and froze in surprise. A moment later, a beast flung Rosetta aside and she flew up in surprise. Will caught her, asked if she was all right, then looked away. The group spotted a small goat. Rosetta said there was more. Tina glanced to the side and told everyone to look where she was pointing. Behind the small goat were sheep, 8 at first, and then 10. Will said it looked that way. The tracks of the 11th are from this little goat. Rosetta held her hand out and said she would never mistake sheep tracks for goat tracks. The goat made a sound. We will examine the goat and decide if he was truly protecting a flock of sheep. Rosetta was surprised that such a small goat guarded the whole herd. Will smiled and said they had come to fight the demon bear at the village's request, and in the end, they had taken all the sheep thanks to the goat. He said he wanted to keep the goat. The goat agreed, and Will thanked him. Tina was surprised Will was talking to a goat. Will found out the boy's name was Kiki. He said he stayed with the sheep for a week to keep them out of trouble and help ward off wolves. After that, they ran into a cave to hide from predators. Defending the herd from attacking monsters every day, he is proud that he stayed to help, but now he is very hungry. If he understands the goat, he is no ordinary animal and may be a divine beast. At that time, the girls stood beside the goat. Tina said Kiki was great, and Rosetta wanted the same goat for herself. Wolves began to howl, and the others noticed immediately. Will and Rosetta came out of the cave expecting one wolf, but saw a pack in front of them. Will realized they had surrounded them. The goat charged into battle, but someone will try to stop him and ask him to wait. It then started butting heads and throwing the wolves in different directions. Rosetta was surprised to see the baby hit the target exactly. We'll say the wolves were scared so they could act. Rosetta notched an arrow on her bow. Tina began casting fire magic. Artie drew her sword and Will charged his fists with magic. Later, Will asked whether they had really dealt with all the wolves. Rosetta agreed and said there were as many as the footprints they had found in the forest thicket. Tina said they had destroyed the demon bear and the wolves and saved the sheep. So they won, and their friendship was stronger. Will asked the girl to wait because they had not yet taken the sheep to the village. After a while, the group hurried back to the village, where the villagers were very happy to see the sheep safe and sound and invited them to stay, but they thanked everyone for their hospitality and left because Saria and Rosa were waiting at the academy. After a while, Rosetta thanked the team for their help. Tina told her not to worry because they had enjoyed themselves and were friends. Will chewed on the goodies and said the souvenirs were gorgeous. And Tina turned to Will and asked whether she could have some goodies too, or whether she did not deserve them. Will praised them for a great job, so Tina deserves it as much as anyone. He hands her a cookie. Tina says that if Will thinks so, she'll try it. She tries the cookie and finds it very tasty. At that time, cult members were watching the guys, and apparently the leader pointed and told his followers to destroy everyone. Tina sat by a tree and told everyone she was very tired. Will stood nearby, watching her proudly, and said they had not rested since leaving the village. The boy offered to go back so they could rest, but Tina turned away sadly, shook her head, and said Rosa and Surya were waiting, so she suggested they go home as soon as possible. Rosetta stared at the kid, puzzled, and asked Ula what they would do with him, since he didn't even fear wolves and seemed more like a monster. Will said he had nowhere else to go, so he took him with him because caring for him was not a burden. Rosa began to smile and thought it was very good. The boy was already sitting up and stroking the goat. Will was suddenly drawn to something, went into a daze for a moment, then gathered himself and turned toward the sound as a fireball appeared in the sky. Excited, he shouted toward the girls, then turned to Artie to call everyone to him. After his shout, a loud explosion sent a large cloud of smoke into the sky. Will was using his shield, which was just smoke. He held it while Rosetta, Tina, and Artie sat behind him. Will said everything happened very suddenly, and it was lucky they managed to hide from the explosion. Artie said she just decided the spot next to them was the safest. A horde of demons wearing different masks appeared by the explosion and closed in around the men, who stood back to back, bracing for battle. Will stood there with a serious face and didn't recognize them. Artie told him they were cult exterminators. The man thought for a moment and realized it was probably him. Tina reacted with fear. Tears fell as she remembered her friend who fought the cult exterminators and vanished in that fight. Will turned sharply toward Tina in a serious way, startling her. She instantly blushed and stood dumbfounded. He then quickly broke into a big smile and said everything was fine and she should not worry. He kept saying she only had to use her magic, and Will thought they were demon wolves in human form. Tina gathered her thoughts and agreed with the guy. Meanwhile, Rosetta fired arrows at the cult exterminators, barely keeping up. At the same time, Tina screamed, raised her arm, began to attack, and realized the cult was agile. Rosetta contacted Will because she wanted to know what to do next. and he thought they needed to find the source of the magic, and his past self thought the same. A strong wind hit Will at that moment. The storm was so fierce it turned trees into smooth, round logs as it passed. I was about to tell him to be careful, but Will cut her off, saying everything was fine. The light was too bright, and the man couldn't see anything. We used a lightning flash spell, and all the cult destroyers next to him flew up. A bright light surrounded those demons. They could destroy this magic only because it had become too widespread. Rosetta, with a serious face, said they had driven her back with a single spell and destroyed the Annihilators, and she and Tina could not figure out what was wrong with the two demons. Artie warned they were still alive, so the girls had to stay on guard, because the Annihilators faltered after losing their leader while these two demons kept advancing. Rosetta confirmed she wanted to make sure Tina was ready, and a sword flashed in their hands. Rosetta held her bow at full readiness. Artie gripped a sword, and Tina held her staff, and the girls finally breathed a sigh of relief after defeating the remaining destroyers. Will went over to Tina to make sure she was okay. She smiled awkwardly to confirm it. After all, they had done a great job with them, and Tina hoped they were gone. The man said awkwardly that they were very tenacious. Tina said awkwardly that she meant they had their revenge, but at that moment a demon reached out to attack her, and the destroyer summoned the seal and aimed it at the men, then felt sick as the seal on his hand suddenly vanished. With a loud cry, the demon flew into the air after a goat threw it, and the goat then began to bleed happily. Will felt embarrassed and couldn't tell if he was alive. Rosetta, standing behind him, could hardly believe it. Will felt crushed by the kid's blow and looked pitiful. Rosetta laughed cruelly and praised the kid, calling him amazing. Artie realized the cult exterminator was not moving. Will was surprised, and at the same moment the demon jumped up from his seat and the mask flew off his face. The others couldn't tell what was wrong with him, since he should have disappeared by now. The clothes on the destroyer began to tear, and Artie shouted for everyone to move away from him and drew her sword. The exterminator grew massive muscles, one arm swelling many times its normal size, and he snapped Artie's sword in half. Artie grew angry but was glad he had finally arrived. The demon bared a terrible grin and growled. The devil himself stood before the men, his muscles straining like they might burst, and he wanted to thank them because they alone had made his rebirth possible. This shows he had already encountered a demon and has experience fighting evil spirits in a past life, but he somehow missed the moment when the devil is reborn after the vessel disappears. Right now, Will was trapped in the body of a small child. The girls beside him were embarrassed by his inaction, and one of them turned to him. The guy immediately jumped toward the devil, deciding to attack him anyway. His speed whipped up a strong wind behind him. The devil laughed as a man's foot struck his head. The devil's head was too hard. The demon grabbed the boy's leg and said he would not give up so easily. The cult leader gripped the man's leg hard and said with a grim grin that he could crush his will like a bug, his childish curiosity having played a cruel trick on him, and the man did not understand what he was about to do. The devil shouted in a low, underground voice, threw Will to the floor, and said he would quickly turn him into mincemeat. And Tina screamed, worried about Will, and had already asked me to help her. Attacks flew at the devil, making him angrier as he called her stupid. She tried to launch more attacks, but she barely had the strength left. The devil laughed and said it would not help. His eyes turned black as night. Turning back to Artie with a grin, he thought she believed cutting him in half would make the matter go away. At that moment, the devil looked at his hand in surprise. A limb was missing from its usual place, and Will, standing behind him, said that although the devil's skin was very hard, it could be cut. His body was very weak right now, and the girls happily called his name. Will thought they were going to kill him now. The devil sat holding his hand, confused about how he could do that, and about what he had done, his face full of anger. Will, still smirking with the same confidence, said he had just learned he was as mortal as they were. The devil bared his teeth, growled, and grew angrier. The devil grew a hand and warned the boy not to be arrogant, because the boy was stronger than the others in many ways and was going to destroy them all. At that instant, the monster's head flew off to the side, but its grin stayed vicious, and Will held a lightsaber, the blow kicking up a fierce gust of wind. Will turned to the girls, a little scared. They stood there completely unaware of what had happened. The devil collapsed behind them. Tina and Rosetta admired Will's reception, and he thanked them modestly. Artie said in frustration that he had just destroyed her as a swordsman, and he would feel embarrassed and apologize to her, but suddenly Tina noticed something. The devil's body began to change shape and looked like it was melting. It became clear it was dissolving into liquid while steam rose from the severed area. He approached Artie because he thought she might know what it was. Artie did not know and thought it wasn't anything good. He thought about it. He tried freezing magic, expecting it to freeze, but the demon kept melting before my eyes. Next came thunder, then fire and wind, but none worked, so he finally tried water. Finally, he saw the water magic working. The monster looked smaller where the water had turned black, and Tina said that proved it. Deciding to continue, he was interrupted when the devil began making noises and changing shape. And then a plate broke, and it was Saria sitting in the children's room. A girl asked if Saria was okay. Saria said her plate had suddenly split. The woman watching the children was frightened and worried. She assumed Saria was hurt and felt very sorry it happened. One girl took the other's cheeks and, looking a little crestfallen, said she was fine. It turned out Saria had seen her brother. He was soaked and serious. Then she saw his past life. It showed her brother fighting someone. Then suddenly, he had wings. Saria realized he was a Tenebris. He stood before her, and behind him she saw the reflection of a figure with 4 wings. The time had come for the team to defeat their strongest enemy. Artie tightened her grip on her sword and prepared to fight. A Tenebrae appeared before Will, a huge winged wolf with a third eye. He couldn't believe it because it couldn't be him. The beast was small and oddly shaped. It seemed they might be related. After all, the real Tenebris had a 9-foot head, a 6-foot tail, and 3-foot magnifiers. Will still did not understand why he was not attacking. Maybe he was afraid to approach because the other had a beast god, or he simply did not want to fight. Tenebris no longer looked at Will and instead looked at Rosetta, who stared oddly at an incomprehensible wolf. The girl did not understand why it was happening and felt shocked, or rather frightened. Not long ago, this Tenebris was a monster. Its power was unmatched by anyone. Suddenly, Rose was addressed. Will was calling to her and Tina. They did not understand what had happened. The man ordered them to return to the academy immediately and ask for help while he tried to detain him. Rosetta warned it was too risky, but Will stayed calm and said they were the ones in danger while he would be fine. Tina tried to object, but the man interrupted her, urging them to run and call for help immediately. Memories of her friend flashed through Tina's mind again, reminding her how much she needed her help, and at the same time tears filled her eyes as she feared she would not make it. Rosetta called out, telling them to listen to Will. Tina turned in fright and said the girl's name. While running away from the man, she asked him not to disappear. Will assured her things were fine and promised he would return alive. The girls ran off in frustration so they could help him. He could use the ring to contact Zenobia, but he didn't know how long he could hold out while they ran for help. Holding the ring, he watched a spatial seal appear as he talked to Zenobia. He said it was Will, that they had been attacked by a beast, and that they were fighting it now. The voice from the ring did not believe him. Will repeated that it seemed to be a Tenebrae, a monster of catastrophes, or probably one of its offspring, and people on the ring told him they would come right away and asked him to wait because safety comes first. Artie said it came from a ring and from a voice she thought she had heard, and that the voice belonged to the teachers. Will said he would explain everything later. In the meantime, they needed to focus on the enemy. She agreed and resumed fighting. Will said he could not let her fight alone, and the man rested his hand on her broken sword as he considered it. Powerless against the disaster monster, the girl could not be helped by an ordinary sword, so he had to strengthen it somehow. She blushed at his actions and felt very embarrassed. Suddenly, the girl had a whole new sword to replace her broken one. She was happy, and the man said he had made it quickly and believed the sword would not fail her in battle. Artie immediately thanked him. Finally, a real Tenebrae appeared before them. They wanted to make sure the girl was ready because they had to defeat him together. A slime and a goat stood behind them, and Artie readily agreed. Will braced himself and said the catastrophic monster could not escape them now. Casting a death blade, he turned Tenebris into an evil creature he had not been before. Suddenly, 2 catastrophic monsters charged them. They grinned viciously and mocked them. I thought it was impossible, but the man asked her to wait. The man activated the seal on the ground to call up the earth's hands, and immediately they rose from the soil and gripped Tenebrus's paws. The man said they had caught him. At the same moment, heavenly arrows fell from the sky and struck the disaster monsters. Someone had already exclaimed, a little incredulous that they had been able to immobilize him. The zebra howled. Steam rose from its nostrils. It began to growl, the growl deepening until a bright light started to emanate from it. Hands rising from the ground began to involuntarily release the catastrophe monster. Will said it could destroy all magic with a single flap of its wings. Will wouldn't let him leave a single scratch on his body. The man summoned the seal, stopping the monster of disasters. Holding the seal back was hard, and it was already starting to crumble. He was slightly surprised as the monster began to arrive, making terrifying sounds like a bleeding goat. As it turned out, the baby goat attacked Tenebral. Will praised him immediately. The man looked at the small goat he'd seen recently and saw a huge animal instead of the earlier one. He protested, pointed to the slime, said they had grown so large, and added that he had already thought about it and realized it was a matter of competition. Immediately, Will's animals began making their own sounds. They moved to surround the disaster monster on several sides and defeated it. The man said that with such a force they might no longer be needed here. The monster's eyes widened. Then he opened his mouth and threw the slime and the goat away from him. It turned out their animals hit each other. The monster glared at the animals she had just hit and immediately moved to protect them, asking the disaster monster not to touch them and warning he would lose his paws. Growling, he stared at the girl and sneered that she was pathetic, and at the same moment glowing lights flew at her and made her squeal. Will ran up to her and told her his name, and the girl apologized, saying she simply had not seen them while she sat on the ground leaning on her arm. The man realized he had touched her with a fog spell and hoped their magic was not cursed and that she would be fine. It became clear he was not dangerous and was extremely agile. They needed a new plan or they could lose. Will thought about using a different magic. Remembering his brothers, he grinned and knew he had to try. Combining the magic of water, earth, and air would make a winning spell. He fired a volley at the disaster monster. When it struck him, he realized it was a water trap that completely covered his eyes. The man said he had deliberately thrown earth and water magic at its muzzle to blind and deafen it, and he started mocking the disaster monster because he could not attack it. He also warned him not to try to clean it up, since even the mist's magic will not help him because his abilities are as strong as his own. Water magic was neutralized, allowing the disaster monster's energy to emerge. He remembered the fight with his brothers and had no choice but to act. A bright light filled the disaster monster's mouth as the Tiniarel began to dissolve. The monster had waited so long that its eyes widened and it began to howl, and foam flowed from the Tiniarel's mouth. His grin grew more vicious. The poison penetrated his body and spread, a spell that would paralyze every inch of him for a long time. Will did not know what it felt like to have his power swallowed. Tenebra will start emitting burning lights again and defend himself with a seal-based shield. Realizing another force controlled things, he knew he could not offer much protection, could barely hold the cracking seal, and had only a little strength left before reaching its center. At that moment she had already started attacking Tenebrali's head, and her sword went straight through the center of the disaster monster. Will shouted her name, and without turning, she shouted that she would distract him. Will's huge goat drove its horns into the Tenebrale's torso, and slime appeared on the disaster monster's paw, turning it black. Saddened, Will said they had all come to his aid together. The man was still holding the finger with the seal, and finally said he could hold on a little longer. He suddenly realized he had found what he was looking for, and with his last strength he told the disaster monster he would destroy its power, smiled at finding a way out, and Tinebrold Gloud spat a torrent of blood. He lay on the ground as we looked at him with some anger, and he did not understand why this had happened since he had reached its center only to destroy the force and did not think the force would destroy the beast, because his hide was quite durable. We thought it over, and agreed that in any case that duel with the stupid brothers had only helped him, and images of the boys pretending to be someone kept returning to his mind. The man realized RT needed urgent treatment because she was seriously injured. The girl realized he had cursed her and held her wound as she tried to steady her words. Will reached out to Artie, and a healing field formed around her, beginning to mend her, and Artie realized his magic was very strong, which left Will confused. Artie said the beast was unbelievably strong, and she could not beat it even with a weapon, and he remembered the little girl telling the master she had failed, even though the demon had no arms or legs. Will chuckled, said Zenobia had a decent student, patted Artie on the head, and added, "It wasn't a big deal because the most important thing was that it was all over," while the girl awkwardly turned to the guy. Behind the boy stood his past life, which told her that if she understood it, she would certainly become a strong warrior in the future. Artie blushed deeply and tried to speak to the young man again. Shocked by the memory of little Zenobia, he immediately tried to change the subject by asking where her sword was, while the girl sat awkwardly and admitted her sword was slightly damaged. Because of that, she controlled him easily. The sword's metal was durable and light, its pattern beautiful, its magic very strong, and its shape fit comfortably in her hand. At that moment, Artie paused between words as she tried to speak, and after her words, there was an awkward silence. Then Will said he would give the girl the sword as long as she did not ask anything. You will notice that the goat and the slime had become regular shapes, and it was good that they were finally behind us. A man lay on the ground trying to catch his breath, terribly tired, and the woman sitting next to him said she was tired too. Will accepted the girl's thanks, and the sword the man made for her was whole again. At last, the heroes could rest. Will and Artie defeated the disaster monster and saw his body turn to ashes, leaving only the core. They still couldn't believe they could beat him just because his weakness was water magic. Will realized this after fighting them on equal terms and resisting all their techniques. No weak spot showed, but something inside him gave way, and they delivered a fatal blow. A wing suddenly pushed through the split core, drawing the group's attention again. Several dragons emerged from the egg. Will stood there, unsure where they came from or what to do, when the master's disciples appeared in the sky. Rosetta and Tina rushed to get help faster. Roso kept urging Tina on. Tina said she could not keep up and asked to rest. Someone else warned them about the monster, so they had to run further to help. If they do not hurry, they will be destroyed. Tina immediately pictured it and did not want it to happen. Suddenly, a call for the girls came from somewhere. They called again, and Tina told Rosetta she could hear them calling their names. Then voices came from above and drew the girls' attention. Rosa looked up angrily and Tina was worried. But the girls' faces soon turned cheerful, and above the treetops, 2 dragons hovered carrying Will, Artie, Zenobia, and Milt. After everything, they were already in the director's office, and Milt wanted a detailed account of what had happened to them in the woods. Zenobia suddenly turned to Rosetta and Tina, said she had not introduced the old man to them, admitted it was her mistake, and asked them to get to know him because there had been no time at the enlightenment ceremony, which made her feel guilty. The girl introduced Milk to the girls, and Milk mentally scolded her for being older than him, but she went on to say he was one of the directors and a very powerful magician. The news shocked Rosetta and Tina, and one said it was a great honor to meet him, while Milk laughed that such formalities were unnecessary. He had heard a lot about Tina, and if he remembered right, she and a classmate had already been recommended as Zenovia's best students. Milt praised the girls, and Tina felt very embarrassed by the director's support. Milt turned to Rosetta and said he had heard she was an excellent hunter and that the school valued hunters highly. Rosetta looked shocked and said she was not that skilled. Zenovia asked me what happened, and then turned to Rosetta and Tina. They said there had been a huge bear, but one of them interrupted to say it was a terrible wolf demon with huge wings. Tina and Rosetta said the damage to livestock in Rosas's hometown and the demon's story, which remains unrevealed, led to a fight with the demon and the appearance of Tenebris. Rosetta heard the name Tenebres because she could not believe it, and Tina confirmed she had said it, since Will had said his own name when he saw the monster. We left awkwardly, saying he wanted to talk about it. Zenobia and Milt repeated Tenebris's name because he was a powerful monster. The Calamity Beast and Tenebris were not monsters other magicians knew about. He and his disciples had destroyed the Calamity Beast, yet some people, like the Seekers, seemed to know about it. The Great Master and his disciples defeated a powerful demon king bent on destroying humanity, and the Guardian army appeared to be skillfully manipulating and hiding the information. Zenobia didn't know what to do next. Milk said she was in charge and had the floor, and the man grew angry. She paused and said they had to omit it and classify the trip because each of them had signed a non-disclosure oath. Will realized he also signed similar papers, though he couldn't remember doing it, and vague memories of signing flashed through his mind. Zenobia said what they were talking about now would not leave the office, but Will thought otherwise, that as soon as people learned about what happened to them in the forest, it would spread. Tinny Brace and the Beast of Calamity were, he believed, names of the Demon King, who had once been defeated by the Great Master and his disciples, and the bandits who attacked them then were his loyal followers. The rescue agency was created specifically to destroy this cult, and no living soul knew the secrets the keepers guarded. Zenobia assumed Tina had been told everything by her teacher, and Will kept thinking it was good that he had not mentioned the beast's resurrection or his true identity. Rosetta said in a serious tone that she had heard about it too and believed the truth was unusual. Zenobia said they needed someone with her abilities, so they asked her for help. The girl blushed and laughed awkwardly. Will realized Rosetta and Tina were incredibly similar. Rosetta did not understand what was going on with Artie and Will. Zenobia sipped from a mug and did not know how to present the information properly. In the end, she said they'd found out beforehand because they were students of their academy and had heard they needed help, and Will laughed awkwardly but sat there speechless. Tina realized why he was so prepared for battle. Rosetta noticed her words because they knew everything and had told them nothing. Will thought about saying he was a 200-year-old man and an apostle. With everything settled, Zenobia asked Will and Artie for a detailed report from the place where the demon was destroyed, and the guys confirmed it. She began to give her report. The directors listened carefully and were intrigued because they had hunted him before, but had never seen anything like it. Milt noted that people sometimes turned into demons, but this was the first time he had seen someone who had already disappeared turn into a demon, or a demon's original form turn into a higher-rank demon, and he had to think it over carefully. Zenobia thought it was silly but asked to stay inside the building for a while instead of going outside. Tina agreed right away. We can understand them because they were scared and did not know what to do. Although it was a high-ranking demon, only he and Artie knew its true form. The others were caught off guard, and he did not believe they had gotten rid of the monster for good. Even if Tina does not inherit the throne, the Empire would not allow her to lose her status as crown princess. The bear demon was alive, but Tenebris had escaped, and Milk tried to call someone, but the phone only hissed. He finally reached someone he could hear. Milt turned to Will and Rosetta because an urgent matter needed their help. Will was trying to figure out what had happened. Opponents were on the horizon and stronger than Tinebis Tina, he said. Tinebis Tina wanted to find out who they were, but Rosetta thought that was impossible. Will did not understand why only he and Rosetta were called for this assignment. Little girls were crying as Will and Rosetta ran to meet their sisters, who jumped into their arms. The teacher apologized and said they could not hold them any longer. They were so worried that they asked to see them as soon as possible. We also apologized and said they had caused them too much trouble. Saria was very worried about her brother and wanted to know he was okay. He apologized for making her worry, and he was fine. Only his clothes were slightly tattered, and this scared the little sister. The guy said he got a little carried away while playing with a goat in a baby bear, and the Grow was shocked to hear about the bear and the goat. She repeated that he had been playing with them. He apologized, but then said they now had a new family member. She rolled her eyes in disbelief, and the sound of a bleeding goat came from the room along with Saria's joyful cry. In Will's room, Saria asked the goat for his paw, named him Belyash, and when he put his paw on her head, he began to bleed. Will laughed at the ridiculous picture. The girl kept going and asked to try again. She asked me to look at her hand and copy her. Their beasts all had divine power. He remembered Rune placing a paw on Saria's head. Saria adored the beasts and seemed to like the child. Remember that Saria had named her pet Whitey. The goat has settled in and no longer seems dangerous, though it sometimes butts Will's leg when it's annoyed. It does not understand why, because Will is not its enemy. Everything is fine. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Someone asked to come in. The door was already open, so he let her in. The girl said they needed to hurry, and the guy said he was on his way. Suddenly, the girl was dumbfounded. She hadn't expected to see so many animals in the room, all of them making noises to greet them, and Will smiled awkwardly and said Soraya thought they had too few animals. Artie said he had to take her to the nursery and that she would see them off. So the man understood this might be Zenovia's order and was told not to worry or follow him but to wait here, though she insisted on going herself. Soraya wanted to go with Will and Artie's sister, and the girl smiled, turned to her, and said she would join them. The man said they had to hurry now. Milk spoke with Will and realized he was in a little boy's body and his magic was weak and unstable. He could not grasp how they had split the core in two. Will had thought it impossible. With the others' help and Artie's distraction, he focused and directed his power at the demon. He also noticed the water magic was weakening the demon and stopping its actions, but the beast of calamity was trying to redirect energy to it to do something, and before that they knew nothing about the demon's weaknesses. We understood everything, but he did not realize they could not predict his actions or even roughly gauge the disaster monster's power, and thanks to them we finally found out. Milt confirmed his thoughts. Andy said he had one suggestion for them and 3 requests. Will was surprised but waited for him to explain. First, he asked if they could help him investigate the disaster monster and his henchmen. Will agreed to cooperate. Milt said Will could use his office whenever he wanted because the necessary papers and documents were stored there, and the poet's work would be much easier, and Milt's would tell them later when they started investigating, and Will understood and thanked me. He decided to discuss requests and said he wanted Artie to be his teacher because they both need constant practice, and he didn't mind since moving around the school would be freer. Will said people might suspect that, as the top student with the divine beasts, he was training with the girl, that Zenobia was feeding the animals, and that Milk said educational guidelines are needed to confirm the animals. They must train harder to get the skills they need. Many applicants want to work with them. Will thought it was reasonable, but it made everyone mistake the measurement results for their abilities. Milt said we could move on to the second request. They had a question. We wondered what exactly he wanted to tell him. Milk wanted to know what Rosetta's abilities were as a potential hunter. Will say she was a very skilled hunter, and the way she found and followed wild animal tracks amazed him. Despite her limited combat experience, she's great with a bow, has a warm personality, and always shows compassion for her sister and friends. Zenobia marveled at her. She thought they made a strong 4-person team, balancing each other and using every power, with Will both a magician and a swordsman, Tina a healer, and Rosetta a hunter. Will confirmed his words and said he also wanted to work with them in the future. Milk thanked him and said they appreciated it. The guy asked the man what the third request was because he thought that was all he wanted to talk about. The man went on, saying they wanted to talk more about Rosetta, or rather her future stay here, and Will did not know what he meant. He wanted Rosetta to become Regina's student because no one matched Regina with weapons. Regina was an excellent archer and swordswoman. Will understand everything, but he didn't see what was wrong with that. Irritably, Milt said it was a shame Regina wasn't taking students. Will blushed when he realized it was about the girl. The man agreed and said the reason would take a long time to explain. Will waited for an explanation. The man said the story took place 90 years ago, when she had only one student. Regina loved and respected him deeply, and spent all her free time on him. One day, demons attacked Regina's hometown and their country, and while Regina defended the townspeople, he protected the nation by acting as a human shield and holding the demons back at the building's gates. They returned and defeated the demon, but it was too late because the student had suffered a fatal wound, and after seeing Regina defeat the demon, he disappeared with a smile. She raised a very strong student who, on the day of the battle, stood by her and saw everything himself. The demons were too strong for them to handle alone, and the enemies had planned everything so Regina would be absent while they dealt with her beloved student. After that, she only said she would never take students again. Will asked whether he was sure Rosetta could be trusted with her or what he wanted, and Milk said that was understandable because she had lost her best student, and he should know what it felt like to lose a friend he had fought with. Zenobia said they had to act to bring her back. A long time has passed since then. They were asked to talk to her and ask her to take Rosetta as a student. We will understand why they told him this story. To help bring Regina back, he drew on his experience as a former master who had lost a beloved student, so he understood her grief better than anyone. We will agree to speak with her. Milk smiled at his master's reply and warned them not to expect much from the conversation. The man still believed the master's words would reach Regina's heart. They wanted to make sure that was everything they wanted to tell him. Milt confirmed and thanked him for listening. The man then reminded them of what they had talked about earlier. Zenobia suddenly said she wanted to start immediately and asked Milt if she could use his room to investigate, which left him confused and unsure how to reply. She finally told him to clean his office first because it was full of junk, and the master would not be able to find the papers he needed, which made Milt furious. Turning to the girl, he said there were many necessary things in his office that should not be thrown away. Zenobia said sarcastically that she wondered what kind of things they were. An awkward pause followed and the office fell silent. He will tell the guys he'll contact them later, even though in his previous life he always insisted everything be organized. A little angry, he said that next time he came to the office, the investigation room should be clean and the necessary items put away. And Milk looked embarrassed, said he understood, and apologized. Will went through the door and saw a girl waiting for him. It was already late, and her appearance surprised him, but she remained calm. He realized she had been waiting here for him all along. She told him not to worry because it was part of his assignment. He sighed, feeling powerless against her. Will contact Artie because he wanted to ask her if she had a minute. It looked like a dining room, and the men were sitting there. They started talking and said that even though he had mentioned it earlier, she did not have to follow him around. Artie said it wasn't about being annoyed. She stared at him with a serious face for a long time and he felt embarrassed. When he began to speak, she became embarrassed too, but he actually wanted to ask her something. At last, the man said he didn't understand why she was so desperate to get close to him and that he wanted to find out. The girl immediately apologized, saying it wasn't what he might have thought. He said, confused, that he hadn't thought about anything like that and had only found it interesting. Artie was very worried about him. We thought these events were not accidental. Knowing who Tenebris is, she was sure Zenobia had told her, and when he attacked them, he was too carried away to explain, because he already knew everything about Will and that monster. So the girl felt embarrassed by what she had said. She felt she should apologize for finding out the secret he had kept all this time. He will ask me not to apologize because everything was fine. Let's return to Artie, because she still did not know his real name. The girl thought Will was not his real name. The man said his name was Adelphus Worms, and that it had been his name in a previous life. Artie turned to Will again and realized he was the right master. Will said she might not believe him, but other teachers could confirm it because they had all been his students. To his surprise, the girl said she believed him and felt he was an unusual person. He was surprised she believed him so quickly. She said cases of reincarnation in their time are very rare, but some have occurred and been confirmed. It was far less common for someone to remember a previous life. No 8-year-old could defeat the strongest magicians or powerful demons so easily, so it made sense that only a great master could handle them, and Will said he defeated them only with her help. The girl remembered something else and decided to check, thinking animals were defined too. The guy confirmed it and said he just wanted to talk about them. He told me a goddess had made him this way. Artie thought the gods must favor him. Then he told Artie how he had come back from death to the present day. The girl could not tell what kind of divine guardians, beasts, or half-breeds they were, and I realized it was all true. Ordinary animals could not have that kind of power, so it was obvious. The man said everything he had just told them was now their secret, and no one except Anobia and the other teachers knew about it. Anobia had already told me not to worry because she would not tell anyone, but she did not understand why he had told her. He said he trusted her as much as he trusted himself. The girl looked confused by that. Though a rescuer, she risked her life for him, and he had already said anyone in her position would do the same. Embarrassed and quiet, the guy turned to Artie with a single request, and the girl began to listen closely. He wanted her to stand with him against the disaster monster. Will wanted a decent man at his side, fighting evil like 100 years ago. The girl thought about it because she would stand beside the master and knew his background. After a short pause, she said it was a great honor to take part in the battle with the great master, and she would do her best not to let him down. Will thanked Artie and asked her to keep calling him Will, not a master. Artie said, "Whatever you say, Will," and I hoped that they would work well together. The guy asked how she felt about working out today. She had already agreed and said she could show him a couple of new moves. Then someone at the door came to find Will to tell him something. Tina and Rosetta were upset because they found out he wanted them to join him. 4 cups of tea were already on the table. Will said they were very well trained, and he had seen it several times, both during the entrance exams and when they rescued him in the forest. But the girls trained every day and did not understand why he was suddenly suggesting they team up. Tina wasn't good at fighting and felt useless. Rosa was out of shape too, and on their last mission they had to run for help, so they could not help the people who needed them. Knowing they would quickly accept his proposal, he asked them to listen because he wanted to take action. The goal is to join with them now so they can later defeat the disaster monster and other demons, and they must train constantly to sharpen their skills and magic. He intended to gather them all to destroy the disaster monster. We will put on serious faces so they know we understood. Even if they do not have time to meet for training, schoolwork will still let them learn and improve their tactics. Tina is also a Dion student, so she is in good hands. He was a little confused. He trusts them, but Tina and Rosetta are still academy students with no ties to the Salvation Army. Tina was a princess, and Rosetta has a sister. If disasters happen during the battle with the beast, they will suffer the consequences. Tina interrupted Will's thoughts, looking puzzled, and said she was not strong enough to fight. Often confused, she ran away and hid in the bushes, useless in battles, and the girl said she could not forgive herself for that. This time, she decided to face her fears and help fight the monster, taking a chance to prove to herself that she was strong and could stand up for her friends and protect them from the monster of disaster. Rosetta thought the same as Tina, so she agreed with every word and wanted to help Will by fighting the demon at his side. If they invade their lands, innocent people may suffer. If something happened to her sister, she would never forgive herself. She wants to get stronger and protect Rose and Will because they are friends. That meant they had to help each other. The man was amazed by how excited they were. Apologizing for pressuring them with his requests, he was glad they all agreed to help and support him. He still wanted to ask them again, even though he already knew the answer, because he wanted to make sure they would team up with him to fight the disaster beast. The girls happily said they were friends and would help. Will said they could start training right away, and the girls agreed at once. The moment brought back memories of his students standing beside him as children. He felt lucky. The girls first had to try to defeat Will using only hand-to-hand combat. Will encouraged them and waited for their attack. They were ready. Regina said her work was done for the day, and it was time to head back. She also planned to teach the boy, who claimed to be a master, a lesson. In the training hall at the same moment, Rosetta landed a clean hit on the target, while Will, standing behind her, praised her and told her she was doing great. He had not expected her to need so much magic to hit the target. Rosetta thanked him awkwardly, and the techniques he was taught in his training came in handy in many ways. Those same training sessions only began a week ago. Before that, he trained every day at Worm's Manor, his birthplace. Normally, when internal magic circulates, the body moves. If it stops, the magic is wasted, so the circulation adjusts and speeds up and control over the magic improves. Behind Will and Rosetta, blows rang out. Tina fired all her fireballs, hit every target and hoped Will saw it. Will said he saw it and that she did it cool. The guys went to the last girl, or rather to Artie, who sprinted forward while drawing a sword. She hit all the targets in different places. Relief made her exhale and smile broadly, because he expected Artie to show excellent swordsmanship. Initially, all movement was clumsy, but after magic power was added, things stabilized, and Artie said she felt great today. Rosetta smiled, thinking they were both so strong. Will told her not to worry because Rosetta was making progress on her own. The signs show these two have an advantage because they are disciples of the great sages. Everything is fine now, so she does not need to worry. This surprised her because she had not expected to hear that addressed to her. Will also told Tina that she was making no progress controlling magic. She could cast fireballs, but her aim was poor, and she had not expected her powers to be ignored while others were praised. Tina realized Will had used magic in the fight, and the master immediately confirmed it. Will then spoke with Artie again, and when she asked the master about close combat, he backed her up. He said she had already mastered magic brilliantly, and with training she could use it just as skillfully to strengthen her body. She understood everything and would do whatever it took. He asked how she liked her new sword. She said right away that its weight and length suited her perfectly. It felt magnificent, like part of her body. After destroying the Makuma, the demon bear, the sword became much easier to use. Because he made it in a hurry, its quality and durability dropped each time he used it. He said she could be proud of this sword now. After all, the sword was an improvisation, one of his ideas. Given that, she should pay more attention to the details. He made the sword carefully, choosing materials so it would suit any fight. She had already seen through his story, but she wanted to know where he had found the materials for the sword. The clever young man and the swordmaster eagerly joined forces, and their sword matched the legendary blade. Production control was Zenobia, and the production itself was a Delphase sponsored by Milk Resources. Will said he was far from such a thing. The girl felt sorry because she had thanked her terracing for only a short time. The guy was surprised that the girl named the sword. Thinking it over, he acted like a proper sword master and armed himself, knowing he had to learn to wield the arty sword before using it. In the early days, it is better to develop magical powers. Will was thinking about taking Rosetta's offer and having a great time with her, but if the wizards were better than the master blacksmiths at this task, he had already thought about the blacksmith's house built by a man from books. Will couldn't understand why the sword was named Terracing, and as he expected, it lived up to its name, while Rosetta watched Artie and doubted she could achieve the same success. The next day, Tina ran up to Will and greeted him, saying eagerly that interesting lessons were starting that day, and Rosetta agreed they would have a good time. Tina wanted to be number 1 in the medicine classes. Rosetta offered to go with her. They fought again because by some miracle they had chosen the same electives. Tina asked Will if he had received his assignments. He did not know how to answer because he thought he only had to prepare something for the final exam at the end of the semester. This surprised the girls. Tina said in frustration that they would no longer do assignments together, and Rosetta was just waiting for this. The guy now began to feel guilty. Rosetta and Artie were very different. The seller thought Rosetta might want to buy a new sword. Artie expected that from Will. The lessons at the academy were now a priority. Will had slain the beast with such skill. Now it seemed he was not going to use that skill. Rosetta was not sure she could match his success. At the same time, in the director's office, a man announced that Will Worms had arrived, was told to come in, and thought he was being approached informally. The slime and a goat immediately rushed toward the door, and the man tried to stop them, but something caught his attention. Someone else was sitting on the couch. A man called him Will Worms. He confirmed it, and said they had not seen each other for a long time, calling the stranger Regina. She slammed her hand on the table and told him to back off because she was talking to him. We laughed and told her she was shallow. His words shocked her. She told him to shut up and called him a brute. Someone called her name to quiet her. Dion told Will that in his new life, he had asked Milton and Zenobia detailed questions about several stories. Will replied to Dion that it had been a long time, about 100 years, and wanted him to understand because he remembered being 2 meters tall then. Dion laughed and said that if it had been like that 100 years ago, a lot had changed since then. And Will Grind agreed, saying everything had changed so much in 100 years that he was still amazed. Regina shouted for Diane to stay back from him, then rushed the man and grabbed his collar, saying he could fool Zenobia and Milt, but not her. The magical animals began making their sounds, and Zenobia watched sadly as the master and Regina quarreled. The man turned to Fury and Beliash and said everything was fine, and that she was a friend, not an enemy. Expecting him to keep pretending to be the master, the girl was cut off when he said he was their master, and she asked him to prove it, and said she would gladly agree. He remembered that Regina must remember the promise she made to him as a child. Regina asked, startled. The memory of making the promise flashed through her mind. That promise was to become strong, and she meant it. Will said she gave him her word to take good care of her guns. Regina was furious and could not understand it because he was only 5 at the time, yet curiosity led her to sneak into his laboratory, and when she saw the stuffed marine animals, she became frightened and burst into tears. The girl called Will a master and said he had promised to keep it secret, but the man sneered that proved nothing, and went on to remind Zenobia about the sword, even though she had already asked him to keep quiet. Zenobia didn't understand, but Regina cried out with joy, burst into tears, and hugged the master by the neck as he tried to calm her. Zenobia turned to the master because she still didn't understand what Regina had done with her sword, but the girl told Will she missed him a lot. Dion extended his hand and said he was glad about this meeting and glad that Will was okay. Will was very happy about it too. Suddenly turning to Dion, he said it was worth telling another old story to convince him, and began to speak. And Dion said he had no doubt from the very beginning that this was their master. When they finally met, everyone waited for Will to explain what had happened to him over the past 100 years. Someone assumed Zenobia had already told her, so she stayed silent to let them hear it from Will. Regina wanted to hear how he defeated Tenebris, and I waited for the full story, but the man could not say a word through that tight hug. She grabbed his hand and pulled him onto the sofa so he could tell her everything, surprising him because he had not expected such interest in this story. Will could not tell what Regina was doing. She hugged the master with a blissful smile, trying to soak up his presence, and he still did not know what she wanted. The girl said he'd grow up soon anyway, so she wanted to cuddle their master while he was still small. Puzzled, Will told her to do whatever she wanted. The story explained what happened after Will's reincarnation. When Regina heard it, she vowed not to forgive those who bullied the master and intended to destroy the worm's family. Will told her not to worry about him, saying that as long as they did not harm others, they could be left alone, and she sadly agreed. Diane told Regina that those with power must be restrained. Regina knew this, but Diane still unites them all. All of Will's students came to him as children, and he actually raised Dion from an egg. Since Dion was his first and oldest student, Will always brought them all together. Regina believed they had caused Dion a lot of trouble, but Dion immediately denied it, saying he was only doing his best. Will approached Dion and told him he was doing well, which surprised the first student, since it was obvious he had worked hard in his absence, and they thanked him at the same time. Tears from Daoul and Lena Tear ran down his cheek. He apologized and said he was just emotional. Will told him not to think about it. Beliash immediately licked his salty cheeks. Will apologized, saying he was still a kid, and Dion said cheerfully that there was nothing wrong with that because Beliash was a sweet child, but it did not mean Will could sit on his head, and he added that everything was fine. Milt shifted the conversation to next steps and wondered how his meeting with Tina and the girls had gone. Everything was fine, he said. They had already started training, and he planned to end the beast of calamity, while Milte asked if his true identity could be revealed, and he said he had only told Artie. The man thought Tina wasn't ready compared to Artie, but it wasn't about being unprepared, and the girls were on a different level, while Artie had already joined the rescue squad. If they found out, he would have to leave. Dion thanked me for understanding. Will wants to talk to Regina because one of the master's wards is a hunter named Rosetta. Regina said she had already heard the name in conversation, and I believed Rosetta had proven herself as a demon hunter. The guy decided to offer her the job of taking Rosetta to his students. She said sadly that he was bringing it up again and that he knew she was not fit to be a teacher and that Milte was more suitable. Milk City was already listed as the master's teacher on paper. Zenobia was Artie's teacher, and Dion taught Tina, leaving her the only one who had not taken a disciple. Even if Milth is only an imagined master and takes Rosetta as a second student, that would still add to his burden. We might realize she is very perceptive. This must have been the atmosphere around the Council of Sages for the past 100 years, and as their teacher he was glad to see it. Deanna agreed with Regina and had no doubts. Milch shouted Deanna's name, but also thought she should take a student. Regina was upset by his suggestion. Will realized this issue had been discussed more than once. Regina considered what she was doing wrong. Who should take a student, and wanted the master's view. She did not think she could take a student, but the master did not see that as a problem. The girl said she was still weak, but Wilden disagreed because he believed she was very strong. Dion said that if she was not ready, then they were even more so. Regina feared she might get her student into trouble again, and Will said they would do everything to prevent it. She regretted that she couldn't do anything back then. Will wondered if that thought weighed on her, so he thinks she should put her soul into another student now. Regina wasn't sure she could because she felt unready. Will smiled and told her she could do anything, knowing he had raised her and asked her to trust him. Since he agreed, the man immediately and happily said her name. Regina explained what it meant and said it was time for her to take on an apprentice. Everyone happily began shouting her name, embarrassing her, but the final decision will come after she meets Rosetta in person and sees what Rosetta is made of. Will said he would take her home right now, but she was still in class, and Regina said she needed to get ready too, so she thought tomorrow would be better. And Milk was surprised she needed to prepare. Regina walked down the hallway thinking about Rosetta and looking forward to meeting her. By then the lessons were over, and Tina ran after the hunter and called Rosetta to ask if she was free to practice. Rosetta said she had errands to handle today and apologized to Tina, saying she couldn't practice, and the two girls waved happily as they said goodbye. Rosetta hoped that if she tried harder, she would not drag everyone down. 4 men stood outside the director's office. Rosetta was very nervous. Before the meeting, Artie told her she would get used to it. But Will scolded Whitey for behaving badly after he stopped staying home. At the door, Artie said they had been invited by the Madame Director herself. Apologizing for the wait, she invited them into the office. The bell rang and the door opened. Sonobia sat at her desk and said it was good they had come. The girl was glad to see everyone. Rosetta was surprised the girl was glad to see them all, including Rosetta. Sonobia turned to someone and said she could go out now. An ominous, loud laugh rang out, confusing all the girls. Someone said they would destroy the disaster monster. Hayoshiko thanked them for that and held a seat on the Council of Sages. Regina Ideru's hero Gracia stood there in armor with an axe, and Tina and Rosetta began to tremble with fear. Ready to accept a new rank just to keep destroying, she wanted to know if they had any future plans for Hayoshiko. Tina curtsied, said she was glad to meet you, and introduced herself. Every rule of etiquette was followed, which is to be expected from an emperor's daughter. Regina narrowed her eyes, so it showed even through her mask. She said Tina was Dion's student, and that she would do her best for her, then waited for instructions from the girl, but the girl only thanked her. The armored girl couldn't believe her eyes when Rosetta appeared, feeling scared and excited but managing to say she was glad to meet her. The armored knight's eyes glinted and frightened the girl more. Will stepped between Rosetta and Regina to calm their flare-ups. Will laughed inwardly because he knew Regina was laughing too, since Hermas had a voice changer and that made it funny for both of them. Later, the man looked at Artie, who kept a completely straight face, the only one careless enough. Her eyes stared into the distance to avoid being noticed as long as possible. He felt she wanted to tear him apart, but she held back. Regina said her behavior had been rude to her, but then added that Sophia had actually recommended that Rosetta be made her student. The girl was shaking. She could not believe what she had heard. Teaching such a talented girl was an honor for her. Rosetta raised her hands to deny it and defend herself, because the knight's words clearly did not match her view. The knight caught her gaze through the narrow eye slits. Rosetta realized it was all a mistake, and that Regina was wrong, because someone like her can't become a student of such a teacher. It looked confused. She didn't turn her student into a weapon. Suddenly the robot spoke in a calm, joking voice and said it did not look as bad as the teachers had warned. Now it was unclear why she had refused. She finally saw why the student had lost all his fighting spirit. Regina asked me to think about it calmly. Then Rosetta turned to the knight, and voices immediately followed her back. Tina saw 2 people there. Zenobia said she was pleasantly surprised by Rosetta's behavior and resilience. The whole office was shocked by the director's words. Zenobia turned to Will, remembering what Will had said about tea and sweets. Beliash arrived with the truck. The animals greeted the director, and cups of tea were placed on the table. Rosetta didn't understand why the director recommended her or whether she was supposed to take on the disaster monster, and she said she understood nothing because some people were getting stronger and others were not. The girl still thought she was useless because everyone else kept getting stronger while she stayed the same. And Zenobia smiled and said that in that case, she thought Regina's student had the best of everything. Rosetta said it was possible for the hero's disciple to serve 2 warring deities. Zenobia said her power did not come from divine blessing. We will leave the battlefield with one of the demon families. Rosetta confirmed Zenobia's statement. There was one thing she never told me because being called as a witness had already made her nervous. Rosetta became an outstanding student with real strength and talent that everyone recognized in different ways. Will's animals sat at Zenobia's feet, making soft, cute noises. Regina waited for a chance to make Rosetta her student. The director said she would find out the details soon. To be honest, even if she lacks talent, she still outdid herself on the test. Will thought the director had said Rosetta made many mistakes during the preparation. The director said she was sure she had no flaws, that she should not rush but must think first and then decide, and Rosetta agreed happily. Bilyashik suddenly ran away and reached the suites of the director's mistress, and someone called the goat a very greedy boy. After that conversation, 2 little girls slept in Will's room while the guys talked. Tina said it would be great if she became a student. It was already agreed. We notice Rosetta's sad expression and wonder what she is worried about. The girl kept thinking about those words, wondering if Will's talents had levels and whether hard work alone would be enough, and she did not know how to improve here, so Will suggested talking to the students. Rosetta remembered Tina once said she wouldn't become an apprentice, and that applied to her now because she felt guilty. Zenobia said they were a bit early today, so if they wanted to meet Dion's student, they should go for a jog now. But in fact, Dion was at the organization right then preparing a training session. Rosetta couldn't understand what Artie was doing because she was lost in thought and extremely focused, and it seemed a little odd. At first, her father was protected by a teacher, but he disappeared when she was 3, and by age 5 the teacher had taken the place of her parents. Rosetta was shocked by Artie's revelation. The girl said that since then she has practiced swordsmanship a lot. She loved sword training from the start, and later began learning from Zenobia. In the past, obtaining a divine sword required paying a great price. Will said that if they fought a monster that was destroying everything around them, and a religious organization that had no weak points, he could defeat them. He added that together with Rosetta, they could handle a dangerous monster. He confirmed his plan by saying they would do it. Rosetta felt sad, but agreed. Then he said they would come back today, which shocked Rosetta even more. Rosetta asked sadly whether she had been helpful, and we will reply that she was wrong and nothing in that plan mentioned it. Will said the students who went in were turning back, so he thought she should have asked him. After all, she and Tina are not yet ready to face truly dangerous enemies. Rosetta noticed Will's comment about very strong opponents and realized all their enemies were stronger than her and Tina. She remembered the devil and Tenebrine. Saying death was not scary was a lie. Fear is a test for each of them. During training, Rosetta kept comparing herself to others, and her self-confidence faded. The girl burst into tears when she realized she could not live up to their hopes. Tina patted her shoulder to comfort her. Rosetta apologized. Will could not believe Rosetta was so unhappy. Frankly, kindness causes a lot of problems for people. It can force them to move mountains, and they often do not realize it. He tried to get Rosetta to listen. He said the most important thing was not to lose hope. Shocked, she immediately condemned Will for his words and refused to speak to him. The guy thought it was better to tell her. People thought she had talent, but her true strength had not yet fully awakened. Rosetta was afraid of making mistakes, and when the time comes for her to fight monsters, he will tell her about it. Despite just starting her journey, she is strong. He told Rosetta again that she could become an excellent student. Also, if Zenobia thinks his students' strengths differ, they will have to give everyone the same load. Rosetta did not understand how it happened. The headmistress urged Regina to take the test, and though she worked hard to finish it and earned a good score, there was still one mistake out of 10,000. Success would make Regina want to grow stronger, and Rosetta should be confident in her abilities. The girl's ears twitched. With full confidence, she said she would pass the test Regina took. The guys were pleased with her attitude and promised to help. She thanked them with a warm smile. Tina said it would be more fun with company. Rosetta tried to stop Tina, but Will interrupted and said Tina could handle it, and Artie agreed. At last, a knight stepped forward to make sure she was ready. Rosetta said she was ready and asked him to test her. The knight said she looked really prepared. Behind her back, Will grinned and said she wouldn't have prepared for them. Regina, wearing a mask, turned to Will, thinking his health would not allow it, and he thought she could have been more patient. Artie told Zenobia she would make sure there was always tea in her cup today, and Zenobia thanked her. The Madam Director was already at the table and hoped she would not notice how Regina was behaving. That night he felt afraid, but replied that someone had once been so childish that Regina even stopped Zenovia's sword and said she would explain the essence of the test only once. As she said earlier, her task is simple. When you reach the dungeon's deepest level, you will need to show all your skills. The girl now realized she would go alone. I realized the problem was that the scout's role was to protect Pat, so I decided to go alone. With the teacher's permission, she'll go straight into the dungeon and figure out what to do there, though she has never been that deep before and will have to try. With lessons already started, she decided to rest tomorrow morning. Will thought she should hurry to the dungeon. A man asked her to do something, and Regina waited for him to speak. He offered to take custody of his younger sister until the exam was over. The girl said they still had time. Zenobia rose, saying the children had stayed home too long and they should visit before leaving. Now that they had time, they could get ready and Tina had to go with them. Soria realized her brother was busy today and would confirm it himself. He promised he would return in 2 days. Rosetta apologized to Rosa. The little girls exchanged glances, and they said there were no problems and they had a big deal. Will said she was already thinking like an adult and that everything was fine. Besides, he and Surya believed everything would work out for their brother. The man was amazed by their trust. So Surya had to take care of Rose. Ren wants to stay with Will too, and Will agreed. When the teacher said the dog is popular with children and helps them a lot, Will praised the dog immediately. Surya noticed that their teacher's mood had even lifted, but did not understand what the teacher was saying. After a short conversation, they said goodbye. Rosetta told me to wait for Will because someone was there. After a pause, Zenobia looked at the girl and said that since she was here, they had prepared something. Rosetta frowned. Various objects sat on the table and Rosetta couldn't tell what they were. Zenobia believed they were needed to explore the dungeon. It will take a long time to reach the right place. With no shops selling everything, she had to pick only the essentials. Tina and Rosetta had to choose wisely. Tina said she had finished the selection. Rosetta asked me to wait a moment, and Zenobia reassured the girl that there was still time. Choosing between magic torches and a spare bow and arrow, she asked me to wait again, but by then they were already near the dungeon with different dragons. A man contacted Zenobia and offered to help at any time. Zenobia said help was always at her fingertips. Will admired the beauty of the building. The couples going together are Tina and Rosetta and Artie and Will. The man watched the approaching dragon and wanted to ride it. The dragon let him and Will thank him, and he was already sitting on the dragon offering his hand to Artie, who said the dragon was ugly. A girl sat behind Will and hugged him, a flush of embarrassment spreading across her face. She had wanted to say something but immediately told him to forget it. As a child, Mrs. Director used to ride her on a horse, and Will laughed because he could already picture it. A sudden strong wind hit the girl's face, and a voice shouted for her to hold on. In the sky, 2 large dragons flew into the distance.